The silence in the ship had endured for centuries, a silence that once spoke of a thriving species. Now it was all that remained. Machines, once humming with purpose, now only echoed faintly in the distant corridors of the vessel. Inside, rows of chambers lined its core, each one containing the dormant form of a human being, frozen in time, their bodies preserved by the cold embrace of technology. They had been forgotten, buried beneath the layers of history that no one cared to remember anymore. The ship drifted in the vast expanse, carried only by inertia, a relic from an era erased from memory. Within the chambers, something shifted. Slowly, but deliberately, life began to stir. One by one, systems designed for this moment awoke, their tasks clear, to bring back what had been lost. For 3,000 years, no human eyes had opened. No breath had been drawn, no word spoken. All that time, humanity had lain dormant, a species pushed to extinction by forces beyond its control, by those who deemed it too dangerous to exist. Earth, once a cradle of life, now a dead world, had been destroyed. Its final cries had long since disappeared into the expanse of the universe, leaving no trace of the civilization that once thrived on its surface. In the dim light of the ship, one figure began to move. He had been a warrior once, a scientist. He had stood on the edge of Earth's last moments, watching helplessly as everything they had built crumbled. And now, after centuries of silence, his eyes opened again. But the world he awoke to was not the one he remembered. His mind was slow at first, adjusting to the overwhelming sense of loss. Flashes of memory, fragments of a life lived so long ago, came back to him. He had been there when it all ended. He had fought, alongside others, against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. And when the end was inevitable, they had turned to this to sleep through the ages, to wait for a moment when humanity could rise again. But what were they rising to? What was left for them to reclaim? The ship was cold. It lacked the warmth of life, the energy of people moving through its halls, speaking, working, living. It was a mausoleum now, a monument to a species that had failed to protect itself. And as the warrior scientist took his first breath, he understood that nothing would ever be the same again. Earth was gone. That truth weighed on him, pressing down with a force that was almost unbearable. The planet he had once called home, the place where he had grown, learned, fought, loved, all of it was nothing more than dust in the wind. The memories of cities, forests, oceans, the people he had known, all of them were fragments, shattered pieces of a story that no one would ever tell. But why? Why had they been spared, when everything else had been lost? That question gnawed at him, pulling at the edges of his mind as he tried to make sense of the situation. He could not yet move from his chamber. His body was weak, having been still for so long. But his mind raced, running through the possibilities, the reasons, the choices that had led them to this moment. They had been the last defense, the last hope for humanity. And they had failed. The enemy had come, and Earth had burned. The stars had turned their backs, the galaxy had moved on. And now, 3,000 years later, it was all gone. But he was still here. As his thoughts settled, a new emotion began to take root. It was not grief, not exactly. Grief was for something that could still be felt, still be understood. What he felt now was something deeper, more unsettling. It was the realization that the universe had continued without them. Everything they had fought for, everything they had believed in it, had all been rendered meaningless. Their struggles, their achievements, their very existence, it was as if it had never mattered at all. The galaxy had forgotten humanity. That was the truth that weighed on him now, heavier than anything he had ever known. And in that truth, there was an anger, a quiet rage that simmered beneath the surface. They had been erased, not by time, but by choice. Someone had decided that humanity did not deserve to exist. And now, they were nothing more than a memory, if even that. His body began to respond to his commands, the stiffness slowly easing as he forced his limbs to move. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the chamber that had held him for so long. It was strange, the sensation of touch, after so many years of nothingness. But it grounded him, reminded him that he was still alive. And with life came responsibility. He would not be content to simply exist. Not in a universe that had cast them aside so easily. No, there was more to be done, more to be answered for. The Earth had been destroyed, but humanity had not been wiped out completely. Not yet. And as long as they still drew breath, there was a chance to understand, a chance to make things right. But what did right mean after all this time? The question lingered, unanswered, as the warrior scientist forced himself to stand. His body protested, weak and unsteady, but he would not be stopped. He had been asleep long enough. It was time to act, time to find out what had happened, and why? Time to see who was responsible for the destruction of his world. He knew, deep down, that the answers would not be easy to find. The galaxy had changed, and they were strangers now in a place that had moved on without them. But that did not matter. They were still here, and as long as they were still here, they had a purpose. The ship hummed around him, the soft glow of the control panels lighting up as systems came online. It was time to wake the others, time to begin again. The galaxy may have forgotten them, but they would not forget. They would not rest until they had answers, until they had justice, or perhaps revenge. He walked slowly through the corridors, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. As he passed the rows of chambers, he could see the others still asleep, their faces peaceful, unaware of the world they were about to re-enter. He wondered how they would feel when they woke. Would they share his anger, his sense of loss, or would they find their own reasons to continue? The answer did not matter, not now. What mattered was that they would wake, and together they would find a way forward, whatever that way might be. As he reached the control room, he paused for a moment, staring out into the endless expanse of space beyond the ship's windows. The stars were distant, cold, and indifferent. They had always been that way, he supposed. But now they seemed more distant than ever, as if the universe itself had turned its back on them. He would change that. With a single command, the ship's systems fully activated, and one by one, the chambers began to open. The time for sleep was over. The soft hiss of the chambers opening echoed throughout the ship, a sound that hadn't been heard in millennia. One by one, the others awoke, emerging from the cold slumber they had been trapped in for so long. The warrior scientists stood in silence, watching as they stirred, blinking against the dim light of the ship, their minds slow to catch up with the reality that awaited them. They were the last survivors of a dead world. That truth settled heavily on him, more so as he saw their faces, their confusion, the tentative hope as they tried to remember where they were and why they had been preserved. But that hope would fade soon enough. It always did. The first to step out of the chamber was a woman, her movements hesitant as she stretched limbs that hadn't been used in centuries. She rubbed her arms, her eyes scanning the room with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. "What year is it?" she asked, her voice rough, as if the very act of speaking was foreign to her. The warrior scientist didn't answer immediately. He watched as the others began to awaken, their chambers slowly hissing open, the cold mist swirling around their feet as they stepped into a world that had long since moved on without them. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "But Earth is gone." There was a moment of silence, a collective pause as the weight of his words sank in. The woman's face tightened, her brow furrowing as she processed the meaning. Another man, standing nearby, let out a sharp breath, his hands clenching into fists. "How long have we been asleep?" the man asked, his voice trembling. "How long?" The warrior scientist shook his head. 3,000 years, give or take. The woman swayed on her feet, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had been a leader once, a commander who had stood on the front lines of humanity's last defense. Now, she was just another soul lost in the expanse of time, trying to grasp the enormity of what had happened. 3,000 years, she repeated, as if saying the words out loud would somehow make them more real. "That's impossible." "It's not," the warrior scientist replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "We're the last of them. Everyone else is gone. Earth, everything, gone." The room seemed to grow colder, the reality settling in like frost on their skin. There was no escape from it now. No comforting lie to shield them from the truth. Humanity, as they had known it, was no more. Another voice cut through the silence, this one softer, trembling with barely contained emotion. A younger man, one of the few civilians preserved, stepped forward. His eyes were wide, his face pale as he looked around the room, searching for answers that wouldn't come. "What are we supposed to do now?" he asked, his voice almost childlike in its vulnerability. The warrior scientist didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out through the ship's windows, into the vast expanse of space. The stars were distant, cold, indifferent. They had always been there, watching silently as worlds lived and died, as species rose and fell. And now, humanity was nothing more than a distant memory, another casualty of a universe that had moved on without them. "We find out who did this," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "And we make them pay." The woman turned to him, her expression hardening. "You think vengeance is going to bring Earth back? You think any of this is going to make a difference?" "No," he admitted, "but we don't have anything else. We were meant to be the last line of defense, and we failed. This is all that's left." The man who had spoken earlier let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "And what makes you think we can even fight them now? Whoever destroyed Earth, they had 3,000 years to grow stronger, to build, to expand. We're nothing but relics from a dead world." The warrior scientist met his gaze, his eyes hard and unyielding. "Maybe, but we're still here, and as long as we're still here, there's a chance." "A chance for what?" the woman asked, her voice sharp. "To die fighting an enemy we don't even understand? To throw our lives away for a planet that's nothing but dust now?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to the control panel, his fingers moving across the keys with a practiced precision that felt both familiar and foreign at the same time. The ship's systems hummed to life, and a holographic display flickered in front of them, showing the galaxy in its current state. "There's nothing left for us out there," the warrior scientist said, his voice quiet but resolute. "No home, no allies, just enemies, and if we're going to survive in this galaxy, we need to know who's still out there, who's responsible for what happened." The woman stared at the display, her expression unreadable. She had fought alongside him, back when the war had still been something they could win, back when there was still hope. But now, that hope was gone, replaced by a cold, empty resolve. "And if we find them?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Then we decide what to do next." Another figure emerged from one of the chambers, an older man with sharp eyes and a steady gait. His face bore the lines of age, though time had not touched him during his long sleep. He had been an engineer, one of the minds behind the ship that had carried them through the ages. His presence was a grounding force, even now. "We can't just rush into this," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to gather information, find out who's still in control. This galaxy has changed. We're the only ones who haven't." The warrior scientist nodded, though his expression remained grim. "I know, but we can't stay hidden forever. We need to move. We need to act." The older man stepped forward, his eyes scanning the display. "And where exactly do we go? We don't even know what's out there anymore." The woman crossed her arms, her face set in a grim expression. "It doesn't matter where we go. What matters is why. We need a reason to fight. Without that, we're just aimless." The warrior scientist looked at her, his eyes dark and filled with an unspoken understanding. "We fight because there's nothing else left." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words pressing down on them all. They were alone in the universe, the last remnants of a species that had been forgotten. But they still had each other, and as long as they were together, there was still a chance, no matter how small, that they could find a way forward. As the ship's systems continued to come online, the group slowly began to organize themselves, each taking on the roles they had held in their former lives. The woman, now their de facto leader, began to issue commands, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. The engineer worked quietly alongside her, checking the ship's systems, ensuring that everything was functioning as it should. But beneath the surface, each of them grappled with the same question: what was the point? What was the purpose of their existence now, in a universe that no longer remembered them? As they moved through the ship, they passed the empty chambers of those who hadn't survived the long sleep. Their faces were etched in the silence, a reminder of the fragility of life. The air grew heavier with each passing step, as if the very ship was mourning the loss of the ones who had not made it. Grief was a heavy thing, and in that silence it wrapped itself around them, suffocating their thoughts. There was no ceremony for the dead, no words to comfort them, only the cold, harsh reality of their situation. The warrior scientist walked in silence, his mind racing. He had once believed in humanity's capacity for survival, in their strength, their will to overcome even the darkest of times. But now, after 3,000 years of sleep, that belief had been shaken. The galaxy was no longer theirs. The future was no longer something they could shape. As they gathered in the control room, the ship's sensors began to pick up signals, faint traces of life from distant stars. The universe was not as empty as they had thought. There were still others out there, moving, living, thriving. But whether they were friend or foe remained to be seen. The woman turned to the warrior scientist, her expression unreadable. "What now?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the flickering signals on the display, his thoughts heavy with the weight of the decision they had to make. "We find out who they are," he said finally, "and then we decide if we fight." The dim lights of the control room hummed softly, casting a faint glow over the gathered survivors. The group remained silent, their eyes locked on the flickering signals on the display. The universe outside their ship was slowly coming into focus, a chaotic, unfamiliar expanse filled with the remnants of civilizations they had never known. But among those remnants, hidden deep within the noise of distant stars, were faint traces of something far more sinister. "We're not alone," the warrior scientist said, his voice breaking the silence. The woman, still standing beside him, nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing as she studied the signals. "They don't look like human transmissions. Alien, maybe. Old, but definitely active." The older engineer, his fingers gliding over the controls with a practiced ease, brought up a different display. His face was lined with concentration as ancient systems blinked back to life. "These signals are connected to a larger network, something vast. We're tapping into the edges of it, but there's a lot more hidden beneath the surface." A deep unease settled in the room. There had been a hope, however faint, that maybe they were alone in this new galaxy. Alone, with only themselves to rely on. But now, faced with the stark reality of their situation, it was clear they were far from it. The remnants of other species, some older, some younger, still lingered, their shadows cast across the stars. And humanity, long forgotten, had returned to a galaxy that had moved on without them. "What do you think it is?" the younger man asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. He had been quiet since his initial outburst, his thoughts clearly swirling in the weight of their shared reality. He stood at the edge of the group, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The engineer paused, his fingers hovering above the keys. "There's no telling, but it's not just chatter. These signals are organized. It's like a network. Something massive, controlling more than just communication." The woman frowned, stepping closer to the display. "A government?" "Maybe," the warrior scientist replied, his voice grim. "Or worse." The engineer's fingers continued their work, and the display shifted again, bringing up a series of encrypted logs, buried deep within the ship's system. They flickered for a moment before stabilizing, their contents beginning to unravel before them. "These aren't just random signals," the engineer muttered, his voice taking on a more cautious tone. "These are logs, from before we went under." The room went silent again, the weight of his words sinking in. The logs stretched back to the time before their sleep, when humanity had still stood, defiant against the forces that sought to destroy them. They were fragments of a forgotten war, a history that had been buried beneath centuries of silence. "Play them," the warrior scientist said quietly. The engineer nodded, his hand hovering over the controls for a moment before he activated the first log. A holographic projection flickered to life in the center of the room, casting faint blue light across the gathered group. The image was grainy, distorted by time, but recognizable. An older man stood at the center of the projection, his face lined with exhaustion, his uniform tattered and worn. He had been a leader once, but now he was a man at the end of his strength, his voice hoarse as he spoke into the recorder. Final log. The Council. They've made their decision. They've wiped us from the records. Earth no longer exists in their eyes. We're the last ones left, and they're coming for us. The group remained silent, their eyes locked on the flickering image. The man continued, his voice filled with the heavy resignation of someone who knew they had already lost. The Galactic Council. They knew we wouldn't bow. They knew we wouldn't submit. So, they erased us. They erased everything. Earth's not even a memory to them now. There was a pause, and the man's face hardened, his voice lowering as he spoke his final words. If you're seeing this, if somehow you've survived, remember who they are. Remember who did this to us. Don't let them forget. Don't let them erase us again. The projection flickered once more before vanishing, leaving the room in a heavy silence. The weight of the words hung in the air, thick with the knowledge that their fight had been far more than just a war for survival. It had been a deliberate act of erasure, an attempt to wipe humanity from existence. The younger man broke the silence first, his voice tight with anger. They didn't just destroy us. They tried to make it so we never existed. The woman's face was pale, her fist clenched tightly at her sides. The Council, they were the ones who ordered it. They wiped out Earth because we wouldn't fall in line. The warrior scientist remained silent, his gaze fixed on the now empty space where the hologram had stood. His mind was racing, processing the implications of what they had just seen. The Galactic Council, an entity so powerful that it had been able to wipe out an entire species, not just physically, but from memory itself. They had been erased from history, forgotten by the galaxy they had once called home. The engineer spoke next, his voice carefully measured. This explains why there's no trace of us left. Why no one remembers humanity. It was deliberate. They made sure we'd be forgotten. A bitter laugh escaped the woman's lips, though there was no humor in it. And they succeeded. We're nothing more than ghosts now. They erased us. And for what? Because we wouldn't bow to them. The younger man's anger flared again, his voice sharp. So what do we do? Go after them. Fight a council that controls the galaxy. We're nothing compared to them now. The warrior scientist turned to him, his gaze steady. We're not nothing. We're the last survivors of a species they tried to erase. That means we still exist. And as long as we exist, there's a chance. A chance for what? The younger man shot back. To get ourselves killed? To make them remember us, the warrior scientist replied, his voice firm. To make them pay for what they did. The room fell silent again, the gravity of the situation settling over them. They had uncovered the truth, but that truth had only raised more questions. The Galactic Council was still out there, controlling the galaxy, and they had been responsible for Earth's destruction. But what could a handful of survivors do against a force so powerful? The woman shook her head, her voice quiet but resolute. This isn't about vengeance. This isn't about making them pay. It's about survival. We're all that's left of humanity. If we go after them now, we'll be wiped out for good. The warrior scientist met her gaze, his eyes hard. And if we don't, what then? We hide? We run? That's not survival. That's surrender. The older engineer, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke, his voice calm but filled with an underlying tension. We need to be smart about this. The Council. They've had 3,000 years to consolidate their power. They're not going to fall because we show up and demand justice. We need more than just anger. The woman nodded, her eyes narrowing in thought. He's right. If we're going to stand a chance, we need to understand who they are now, what they've become. We can't go in blind. The warrior scientist clenched his fists, his frustration palpable. But he knew they were right. Charging headfirst into a war they didn't understand would only lead to their destruction. They needed information. They needed allies. They needed time. "We start with the logs," the engineer said, his fingers already moving across the controls. "There's more here, more than just this final message. If we can piece together what happened after we went under, we might be able to figure out who's still out there, who might still be willing to fight." The younger man scoffed. "You think anyone remembers us? After 3,000 years? The engineer didn't look up from his work, his expression grim. "Maybe not. But there might be others who have suffered at the Council's hands. Other species who were erased, just like us." The room fell into a tense silence as they waited for the next log to play. The flickering hologram came to life again, this time showing a different figure, an alien, its features unfamiliar, but its voice filled with the same quiet determination they had seen in the previous message. "They think they can erase us. They think they can rewrite history. But they can't erase what we were. They can't erase the truth." The log continued, revealing a fragmented history of political manipulation, alliances forged and broken, and the slow, calculated erasure of species that had refused to bow to the Council's will. Earth had been one of many. Humanity's destruction was just another entry in a long list of civilizations that had been erased. As the log ended, the room remained silent, the gravity of their situation weighing heavily on them all. The galaxy had forgotten them, but now they knew the truth. The woman turned to the warrior scientist, her voice quiet but filled with a newfound resolve. "This isn't just about us. There are others out there, others who were erased, just like we were. If we can find them, if we can unite them." The warrior scientist nodded, his gaze steady. "Then maybe we can make them remember." As they stood in the dim light of the control room, the weight of the universe pressing down on them, a single question lingered in the air, unspoken but felt by all. What does justice look like in a universe that has forgotten you? And can vengeance ever restore what was lost? The answer, they knew, would define their future. There was silence in the control room, but not the kind born from peace. It was a silence filled with memories, heavy and dense, as though the air itself carried the weight of 1,000 forgotten moments. The warrior scientist stood at the forefront, his eyes fixed on the blank display where the last hologram had flickered out. His mind, however, wasn't here in this cold room, surrounded by technology older than the stars outside. No, he was back on Earth, Earth as it had been, before the Council's judgment fell upon it. The echoes of the old logs still hung in the air, but they were drowned by the memories surfacing from deep within him. They came unbidden, rising like ghosts from the long-forgotten past. He could see it now, clearer than ever, the vibrant blue of Earth's skies, the warmth of the sun on his skin, the bustling cities filled with life and laughter. It had been imperfect, sure, but it had been home, and it was real. Real. That word lingered in his thoughts, haunting him. What they had now felt so far removed from that reality, like living inside a hollow shell. The universe they now inhabited, vast and unfamiliar, was indifferent to them. And yet, here they stood, the last remnants of a species long thought extinct. They had survived, but survival had come at a cost. The question that gnawed at him, unrelenting, was whether survival alone was enough. Could survival make up for all that had been lost? His gaze drifted over the others, their faces etched with a similar quiet contemplation. They, too, were wrestling with the weight of the revelations. Each one carried the same scars, the same burden of knowing that their world, their people, had been erased. The younger man, who had been so quick to anger, now stood with his arms folded, his brow furrowed in thought. There was no more fire in his eyes, only a cold calculation. The woman was pacing, her footsteps soft but steady, as though she could walk off the weight of the knowledge pressing down on them. The older engineer was hunched over the console, his hands motionless, staring blankly at the array of lights and signals that seemed suddenly insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Earth. It was the one thing that connected them all, the one memory they shared, even if it was a memory now tainted by the knowledge of its destruction. He remembered the last time he had stood on Earth. The city had been alive with a hum of civilization, the streets crowded with people going about their lives, unaware of the doom that loomed over them. There had been rumors, of course whispers of the Council's growing discontent, of the impending war. But no one had truly believed that it would come to this. Humanity had always been resilient. They had faced challenges before, challenges that should have broken them, and they had always risen above. They had conquered their world, explored the stars, built empires that stretched across galaxies. They had believed, with the arrogance of a species that had known only success, that they were untouchable, that nothing could erase them. But the Council had been patient. They had watched from the shadows, biding their time, waiting for the moment when humanity's confidence would be its undoing. When the attack had come, it had been swift and merciless. The skies had darkened with the Council's ships, their weapons raining down on the cities, reducing them to rubble. The warrior scientist had fought, as had every able-bodied human left, but it had been futile. The Council's forces were too vast, their technology too advanced. Earth had fallen in a matter of days. He could still hear the cries of the dying, the roar of flames as entire cities were consumed. He had watched from the front lines as the world he had known crumbled before him, helpless to stop it. But what haunted him most was not the destruction. It was the faces of the people, the look in their eyes as they realized that this was the end, that everything they had built, everything they had fought for, was gone, that their legacy, their history would die with them. Back in the present, the warrior scientist clenched his fists, the memory searing itself into his mind. He had never truly accepted it. Not then, not now. There was something fundamentally unnatural about the way it had all ended, so sudden, so absolute. The Council had wielded a power far beyond mere destruction. They had wiped Earth from existence, not just physically, but from the annals of history. The idea that a civilization as great as humanity could be erased so thoroughly that it could simply disappear was something that defied comprehension. And yet, here they were, the last survivors of a forgotten people, standing on the precipice of an unknown future. Are we truly the last? The woman asked softly, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of the question she was asking. The warrior scientist looked up, meeting her gaze. Her eyes were filled with something he hadn't seen in them before: doubt. She was always so strong, so composed. But now, even she was struggling to come to terms with the enormity of what they had learned. He wanted to answer her, to reassure her, but the words wouldn't come. Because, in truth, he didn't know. Maybe they were the last. Maybe there were others out there, scattered across the stars, clinging to the hope that somehow humanity could rise again. Or maybe they really were the final remnants, the last echoes of a species that had been wiped from existence. The younger man scoffed, his voice sharp in the stillness. Does it even matter? We're here, and that's all that counts. The warrior scientist shook his head slowly. It matters. It matters because if we're the last, then everything we do from this point forward defines what remains of humanity. If we're all that's left, then we carry the weight of everything that came before us. The younger man's expression hardened, his arms tightening across his chest. And what exactly are we supposed to do with that? Carry on like nothing happened. Pretend we can rebuild from the ashes of a world that's been forgotten. The older engineer finally spoke, his voice calm but laced with the same quiet sorrow that hung over the rest of them. We don't have to rebuild. We just have to survive. We have to remember. Remember. That word struck something deep within the warrior scientist. It echoed in his mind, reverberating through the years, through the loss, through the dust and the decay. Humanity had always been a species built on memory, on the passing down of knowledge, of stories, of history. But what was memory in a universe that had forgotten you? What was legacy when there was no one left to remember it? As he pondered this, another memory surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. The day he had left Earth for the last time. The skies had been burning then, too, filled with the Council's ships, their weapons tearing through the atmosphere. But he hadn't been on the ground with the others. He had been one of the lucky few, chosen to board the ship that would carry humanity's last hope into the stars. It had been a decision made in haste, in desperation. A decision that had saved his life, but at what cost? He could still see the faces of those left-behind friends, comrades, people he had fought alongside for years, people who had looked to him for guidance, for leadership, and he had left them to die. He had told himself it was the only choice, that he had no other option. But deep down, he knew it wasn't true. He had chosen to survive, and in doing so, he had abandoned those who couldn't. It was a choice that haunted him still, even after all these years. The cold reality of their present snapped him back to the moment. The Council was still out there, and they were still the same force that had wiped out Earth. Nothing had changed in that regard. But what had changed was their understanding of the stakes. They were no longer fighting just for survival. They were fighting for memory, for legacy, for the very essence of what it meant to be human. The woman spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. What if vengeance isn't the answer? What if this path only leads to more destruction? Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. It was a question none of them had dared to ask until now. They had all been so focused on survival, on revenge, that they hadn't stopped to consider what that revenge might cost. The warrior scientist met her gaze, his expression thoughtful. Vengeance isn't the answer, he said slowly, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. But it's not about vengeance. It's about making sure that what happened to Earth doesn't happen again. It's about ensuring that we're not erased, that humanity our memory lives on. The older engineer nodded, his voice quiet but resolute. We're not fighting just for ourselves. We're fighting for those who came before us, for those who didn't get a chance to survive. The younger man, who had been so full of anger moments before, was silent now. His gaze was distant, lost in thought. He, too, understood the gravity of what they were facing. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice, about ensuring that humanity wasn't forgotten. In the quiet that followed, the warrior scientist returned to the console, his fingers moving over the controls with a sense of purpose. They had discovered the names of the council members responsible for Earth's destruction. They knew their enemies, knew their faces, knew their weaknesses. It was a start, but it was only the beginning. The challenge ahead was immense. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy that had already proven its willingness to annihilate them. But they had something the Council didn't: a purpose, a reason to fight, a legacy to protect. As the warrior scientist stared at the star-filled expanse before him, he pondered the path ahead. The journey would be long and fraught with danger, but it was a journey they had to take. For the sake of humanity's memory, for the sake of those who had been lost. And so, with a quiet resolve, he turned to the others. We begin with what we have, he said. We fight with what we know, and we remember why we fight. It was a simple statement, but it carried with it the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. The path ahead would be hard, and the costs high. But as long as they remembered, as long as they fought for something greater than themselves, they would not be forgotten. And in that truth, they found their strength. The hum of the ship's engines was a constant reminder of their journey, a mechanical heartbeat that pulsed beneath the sleek exterior of their vessel. The warrior scientist stood alone on the bridge, gazing out into the infinite expanse of space. It was an endless sea of stars and darkness, an imposing reminder of how small they were in the grand scheme of the galaxy. The ship was headed toward the nearest populated world, a decision made with urgency and determination. The hope was that this world, nestled in the outer fringes of the Galactic Council's dominion, would provide some semblance of the intelligence they needed. But as the distance closed between them and their destination, the tension among the survivors grew palpable. The woman, who had always been the most composed of the group, was now deep in conversation with the older engineer in the ship's quarters. Her voice was steady, but her words revealed the underlying strain of their situation. We're walking into a hornet's nest, she said, her tone betraying a hint of anxiety. The Council's reach extends far beyond what we imagined. This isn't just about getting information, it's about survival. The older engineer nodded, his fingers tracing the lines of a star map projected in the air. every step we take is a gamble. We have to be careful. If we're discovered, we're done for," she finished for him, her expression grim. "I know." The conversation between them was filled with a kind of gravity that only comes from facing an unknown and dangerous future. They were no longer just seeking revenge. They were venturing into a labyrinth of alien politics, where every faction had its own interests and allegiances. The Council was the puppet master, and every species in its realm was a pawn in its vast game of control. As they approached the outer rim of the populated world, the crew prepared to go undercover. They had to blend in, to become part of the myriad species that inhabited this world. The human survivors, now a ragtag group of clandestine operatives, donned disguises that would make them appear as one of the galaxy's many diverse species. In the cramped confines of the ship's makeshift preparation area, the younger man was meticulously adjusting the final touches of his disguise. His hands worked with precise efficiency, but his eyes were clouded with doubt. "Do you really think this is going to work?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "How do we blend in with species we've never even seen before?" The warrior scientist, already clad in his own disguise, glanced over with a hint of sympathy. "We don't have a choice. We have to blend in, or we risk exposure. We know nothing about this world's security or how the Council's influence operates here. Disguises are our best chance." The younger man nodded slowly, though his uncertainty was evident. "I just hope we're not walking into a trap. If the Council's agents are here, they'll be on the lookout for anything out of the ordinary." The warrior scientist's gaze was steady as he responded. "We have to trust in our preparation. The Council's reach is extensive, but so is our determination. We're not just fighting for ourselves, we're fighting for everything that was lost." As the ship touched down on the populated world, the atmosphere outside was a blend of alien sounds and smells, a stark contrast to the sterile environment they had grown accustomed to. The streets were filled with a cacophony of voices, the languages foreign and strange, but the feeling of the city was both unsettling and intriguing. The survivors stepped out, their disguises complete, and were immediately immersed in a world that seemed both vibrant and intimidating. Tall spires reached toward the sky, their surfaces shimmering with iridescent hues. Alien creatures of every shape and size moved about, their lives unfolding in a flurry of activity. The city was a living tapestry of different species, their interactions a complex dance of politics and commerce. The woman and the older engineer led the way, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of trouble. They moved with a practiced ease of those who had spent years navigating complex social structures. The younger man, meanwhile, struggled to keep his composure, his anxiety palpable beneath the surface of his disguise. As they ventured deeper into the city, they could not escape the feeling of being watched. The streets were lined with surveillance drones, their lenses swiveling to capture every movement. The Council's presence was unmistakable, its control woven into the very fabric of the city. The survivors found a safe house, a small, nondescript location hidden among the city's myriad buildings. Inside, they gathered around a makeshift command center, the older engineer working tirelessly to tap into the city's data networks. His fingers danced over the controls, seeking any information that could provide insight into the Council's operations. The woman, meanwhile, took a seat beside the younger man, her expression one of deep contemplation. "We're here now," she said softly, "but what do we do once we have the information? How do we even begin to take on something as vast as the Council?" The younger man looked up, his expression resolute despite his previous doubts. "We find out everything we can. We need to understand how the Council operates, what its weaknesses are. We need to know what we're up against." The warrior scientist, who had been observing quietly, spoke up. "It's not just about gathering intelligence, it's about understanding our place in this galaxy. We've been forgotten, erased from history. We need to make them remember. We need to show them that humanity is more than just a myth." The woman nodded, her gaze focused. "But we also need to consider the consequences. We're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for the legacy of those who came before us. We need to be careful not to let our anger cloud our judgment." As the hours passed, the older engineer's efforts bore fruit. He had managed to access classified data about the Council's operations, revealing a complex web of alliances and rivalries. The Council's power was far-reaching, but it was not absolute. There were factions within the galaxy that resented the Council's control, species that sought their own freedom. The revelations were both enlightening and disheartening. The Council's control was more entrenched than they had imagined, but the seeds of dissent were there. The galaxy was a place of intricate politics, where every faction had its own agenda. To fight the Council, they would need to navigate this complex landscape, forging alliances and exploiting weaknesses. The younger man studied the data with a grim expression. We're up against more than just the Council. We're up against an entire system of power and control. It's going to be a long and difficult fight. The warrior scientist nodded, his gaze steady. We knew it wouldn't be easy, but we have something they don't. We have our purpose. We have our reason for fighting. The woman looked up, her eyes reflecting the weight of their mission. And we have each other. We need to stay united, no matter how difficult it gets. Our strength lies in our resolve and our unity. The night on the alien world was an unsettling expanse of darkness, punctuated only by the shimmering lights of distant structures. The city, though bustling during the day, took on a sinister quiet as the two moons cast their eerie glow over the streets. The human survivors, now deep within enemy territory, found themselves grappling with the tension of their covert mission. The safe house was quiet, but for the occasional hum of machinery and the murmurs of strategizing. The warrior scientist and his team had made significant progress in understanding the Galactic Council's operations, but they knew that knowledge alone would not be enough. They needed to act, to make their presence felt in a galaxy that had long forgotten them. The sudden blare of alarms shattered the stillness. The sound cut through the air with an urgency that jolted the survivors into action. The older engineer, who had been monitoring security feeds, turned to the others with a look of grim realization. We're compromised, he said, his voice tight with concern. We've been detected. The woman, her face a mask of determination, immediately began coordinating their response. We need to move. Now. The younger man, who had been grappling with his fears, swallowed hard as he picked up his weapon. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes were resolute. Where do we go? Through the maintenance tunnels, the warrior scientist replied, pointing to a map projected on the wall. They'll be less monitored. The team moved swiftly through the tunnels, their footsteps echoing off the metallic walls. The air was cold and stale, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. They navigated the labyrinthine passages with a practiced efficiency, but the sense of impending danger was palpable. As they emerged from the tunnels into the open air, the scene that greeted them was both breathtaking and horrifying. An alien species part of the Council's enforcers had surrounded the area. Their armor was sleek and menacing, their weapons glowing with an ominous light. They were imposing figures, their presence a stark reminder of the power they wielded. Without warning, the enforcers moved in, their weapons crackling with energy. The human survivors were caught in the crossfire. The warrior scientist sprang into action, his movements fluid and precise as he engaged the enemy. The fight was fierce and chaotic, a brutal ballet of violence and strategy. The younger man fought with a mix of fear and determination. Each clash of weapons, each burst of energy, was a reminder of the stakes. His heart raced as he faced off against an alien adversary, his movements driven by the need to protect his comrades. The woman, ever the strategist, coordinated their efforts from a central position. Her eyes darted between the combatants, her mind calculating the best course of action. She issued commands with a steady voice, her focus unwavering, even as the battle raged around her. The conflict was swift and brutal. The survivors fought with everything they had, their training and resolve pushing them through the onslaught. But amidst the chaos, the warrior scientist found himself grappling with a deeper, more troubling question. Each alien he faced fell with a finality that was both satisfying and disturbing. The thrill of combat was undeniable, but so was the weight of taking lives. He saw the look in the eyes of his opponents, the fear, the confusion, and he couldn't help but question the morality of their mission. Were they becoming the very monsters they sought to destroy? The question echoed in his mind as he struck down another enforcer, his actions driven by a sense of vengeance, but tainted by a growing sense of unease. The woman's voice cut through his thoughts, her words sharp with urgency. "We need to fall back. We're outnumbered." The command broke the spell, and the survivors regrouped, retreating to the tunnels with the enemy hot on their heels. The battle had taken its toll, but they had achieved their immediate goal: escape. Back in the safety of their hideout, the atmosphere was heavy with the aftermath of the fight. The team was battered and exhausted, their faces reflecting the strain of their ordeal. The warrior scientist sat apart from the others, his mind consumed by the ethical implications of their actions. The woman approached him, her expression one of concern. "Are you all right?" He looked up, his gaze distant. "I'm fine. It's just the fight. It was necessary, but I can't shake the feeling that we're losing something important in all this." She sat beside him, her voice soft but resolute. "We're fighting for survival, for vengeance, but that doesn't mean we have to lose ourselves in the process. We need to remember why we're doing this." The older engineer, overhearing their conversation, added his thoughts. "Every action has consequences. We need to stay mindful of what we're becoming, not just what we're fighting against." The younger man, who had been listening silently, finally spoke up. "We're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for everything that was lost. We need to find a balance, a way to honor what we had while facing what's ahead." The warrior scientist nodded slowly, the weight of their words settling over him. "You're right. We need to be careful. We're not just avenging our past, we're shaping our future. We have to ensure that future is worth fighting for." The aftermath of the battle left the hideout in a state of weary silence. The once bustling safe house now felt hollow, its rooms echoing with the ghosts of recent conflict. The humans, exhausted and bruised, had retreated to their makeshift sanctuary, seeking solace in the dim light that filtered through narrow windows. The room's sparse furnishings did little to shield them from the emotional toll of their struggle. The warrior scientist sat apart from the others, his back against a wall, staring blankly at a map of the city strewn across a table. The flickering light from a nearby lamp cast long shadows, accentuating the lines etched into his face. His hands trembled slightly as he traced the paths they had taken, but his mind was elsewhere, lost in a labyrinth of regret and reflection. The woman, her demeanor as calm as ever, approached him and sat down. She could see the burden in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the weight of their actions. "We've all seen what war does," she said softly, her voice carrying a depth of understanding. "But it's harder when it's us who have to bear the consequences." The warrior scientist turned his gaze towards her, his expression a mix of weariness and resolve. "I never imagined it would be like this. Each alien we fought, each life we took, it's all starting to feel like more than just survival. It's as if we're losing a part of ourselves with every battle." Elsewhere, the younger man sat by himself, his weapon resting on the ground beside him. The adrenaline of combat had worn off, leaving a heavy void in its wake. He ran his fingers over the cold metal, a stark reminder of the violence he had been a part of. The distant sounds of his comrades moving about were muted to him, lost in his internal struggle. The older engineer found him there, his face showing a mixture of sympathy and concern. "You've been quiet," he observed, taking a seat beside the younger man. "How are you holding up?" The younger man looked up, his eyes reflecting a storm of emotions. "I don't know if I can keep doing this. Every time I close my eyes, I see the faces of those we fought. They were just doing their jobs, like us. How do we justify what we've done?" The older engineer nodded slowly, understanding the depth of his struggle. "There's no easy answer. We fight because we have to, but that doesn't mean it doesn't take a toll on us. We have to find a way to carry on without letting the darkness consume us." In a corner of the hideout, the woman and the older engineer engaged in a deep conversation. They discussed the nature of their mission and the broader implications of their actions. The woman, though usually composed, was deeply affected by the recent events. "It's strange," she said, her tone contemplative. "We're fighting for vengeance, but what are we really achieving? The world we knew is gone. We're avenging a past that can never be restored. Is this cycle of revenge worth the cost?" The older engineer leaned back, his face thoughtful. "Vengeance is a powerful motivator, but it's also a dangerous one. It's easy to become consumed by it, to lose sight of what we're fighting for. The real challenge is to find meaning in our struggle beyond just seeking retribution." The woman sighed, her gaze distant. "I used to believe that justice would bring us peace, but now I'm not sure. We've seen the horrors of war up close. How do we reconcile that with the idea of justice?" The older engineer looked at her, his eyes reflecting a shared sense of disillusionment. "Perhaps justice isn't as clear-cut as we thought. Maybe it's not about making things right, but about finding a way to live with what we've done. We have to learn to navigate this new reality, to find a way to honor our past while forging a path forward." The warrior scientist, now joined by the others, gathered them for a brief meeting. The atmosphere was somber, each member grappling with their own reflections and doubts. He addressed them with a tone that conveyed both resolve and vulnerability. "We've all seen what war does to people," he began, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "But we have to remember why we're here. We're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for something greater, for a legacy that deserves to be remembered. But we have to be mindful of how we fight. We can't let vengeance strip away our humanity." The woman nodded, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of agreement and concern. "We need to remember what we stand for. It's easy to get lost in the anger and the pain, but we have to keep our focus on our goal. We have to find a way to make a difference without losing ourselves in the process." The younger man, his voice carrying a tone of resolve, added, "We're not just fighting for revenge. We're fighting for a future, for something that can't be measured in battles won or lost. We have to find a way to honor our past while building something meaningful for the future." The older engineer's eyes reflected a deep understanding as he spoke. "Each of us carries a burden, but we also carry a hope. We have to balance the weight of vengeance with the pursuit of something greater. We have to find a way to make our struggle worthwhile." The aftermath of the battle left the hideout in a state of weary silence. The once bustling safe house now felt hollow, its rooms echoing with the ghosts of recent conflict. The humans, exhausted and bruised, had retreated to their makeshift sanctuary, seeking solace in the dim light that filtered through narrow windows. The room's sparse furnishings did little to shield them from the emotional toll of their struggle. The warrior scientist sat apart from the others, his back against a wall, staring blankly at a map of the city strewn across a table. The flickering light from a nearby lamp cast long shadows, accentuating the lines etched into his face. His hands trembled slightly as he traced the paths they had taken, but his mind was elsewhere, lost in a labyrinth of regret and reflection. The woman, her demeanor as calm as ever, approached him and sat down. She could see the burden in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the weight of their actions. "We've all seen what war does," she said softly, her voice carrying a depth of understanding. "But it's harder when it's us who have to bear the consequences." The warrior scientist turned his gaze towards her, his expression a mix of weariness and resolve. "I never imagined it would be like this. Each alien we fought, each life we took, it's all starting to feel like more than just survival. It's as if we're losing a part of ourselves with every battle." Elsewhere, the younger man sat by himself, his weapon resting on the ground beside him. The adrenaline of combat had worn off, leaving a heavy void in its wake. He ran his fingers over the cold metal, a stark reminder of the violence he had been a part of. The distant sounds of his comrades moving about were muted to him, lost in his internal struggle. The older engineer found him there, his face showing a mixture of sympathy and concern. "You've been quiet," he observed, taking a seat beside the younger man. "How are you holding up?" The younger man looked up, his eyes reflecting a storm of emotions. I don't know if I can keep doing this. Every time I close my eyes, I see the faces of those we fought. They were just doing their jobs, like us. How do we justify what we've done?" The older engineer nodded slowly, understanding the depth of his struggle. "There's no easy answer. We fight because we have to, but that doesn't mean it doesn't take a toll on us. We have to find a way to carry on without letting the darkness consume us." In a corner of the hideout, the woman and the older engineer engaged in a deep conversation. They discussed the nature of their mission and the broader implications of their actions. The woman, though usually composed, was deeply affected by the recent events. "It's strange," she said, her tone contemplative. "We're fighting for vengeance, but what are we really achieving? The world we knew is gone. We're avenging a past that can never be restored. Is this cycle of revenge worth the cost?" The older engineer leaned back, his face thoughtful. "Vengeance is a powerful motivator, but it's also a dangerous one. It's easy to become consumed by it, to lose sight of what we're fighting for. The real challenge is to find meaning in our struggle beyond just seeking retribution." The woman sighed, her gaze distant. "I used to believe that justice would bring us peace, but now I'm not sure. We've seen the horrors of war up close. How do we reconcile that with the idea of justice?" The older engineer looked at her, his eyes reflecting a shared sense of disillusionment. "Perhaps justice isn't as clear-cut as we thought. Maybe it's not about making things right, but about finding a way to live with what we've done. We have to learn to navigate this new reality, to find a way to honor our past while forging a path forward." The warrior scientist, now joined by the others, gathered them for a brief meeting. The atmosphere was somber, each member grappling with their own reflections and doubts. He addressed them with a tone that conveyed both resolve and vulnerability. "We've all seen what war does to people," he began, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "But we have to remember why we're here. We're not just fighting for ourselves, we're fighting for something greater, for a legacy that deserves to be remembered. But we have to be mindful of how we fight. We can't let vengeance strip away our humanity." The woman nodded, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of agreement and concern. "We need to remember what we stand for. It's easy to get lost in the anger and the pain, but we have to keep our focus on our goal. We have to find a way to make a difference without losing ourselves in the process." The younger man, his voice carrying a tone of resolve, added, "We're not just fighting for revenge. We're fighting for a future, for something that can't be measured in battles won or lost. We have to find a way to honor our past while building something meaningful for the future." The older engineer's eyes reflected a deep understanding as he spoke. "Each of us carries a burden, but we also carry a hope. We have to balance the weight of vengeance with the pursuit of something greater. We have to find a way to make our struggle worthwhile." The conversation had stirred a sense of camaraderie among the survivors, but it also brought to light the weight of their mission. The hours that followed were spent in a mix of quiet reflection and practical preparation. The team knew that their fight was far from over, and the challenges ahead were as daunting as ever. The warrior scientist took a moment to look out of a window, watching as the city lights flickered in the distance. The alien landscape stretched out before him, a constant reminder of the world that had replaced the one he once knew. His thoughts turned inward as he considered the path they had chosen. He wondered about the cost of their mission, not just in terms of lives lost, but in terms of their own souls. The weight of vengeance was becoming increasingly evident, not just in their actions, but in their very demeanor. It was as if the mission had begun to shape them into something they hadn't anticipated. The battle had brought them closer, but it had also exposed the fragility of their resolve. The lines between justice and revenge were blurring, leaving them to navigate a moral quagmire with no clear path. The woman's voice interrupted his thoughts as she approached him. "What's on your mind?" she asked, her tone gentle. He turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I keep wondering if we're losing sight of what's truly important. We're fighting for a future that seems increasingly elusive. The more we fight, the more we risk becoming the very things we despise." She nodded, understanding the depth of his concern. It's a difficult balance. We want to honor our past and secure our future, but the line between justice and vengeance is thin. We have to be careful not to let our anger define us. The conversation continued, touching on the philosophical and emotional aspects of their mission. The woman and the warrior scientist explored the nature of their quest, the weight of their actions, and the impact on their sense of self. Each revelation was a step toward understanding, but it also deepened the complexity of their journey. Later, as the survivors rested, the older engineer found himself lost in thought. The battle had been intense, and the physical wounds had begun to heal, but the emotional scars were less easily treated. He sat alone in a corner, pondering the philosophical implications of their struggle. His mind wandered to the nature of revenge and its place in their lives. Was it a necessary evil, or was it a path that would ultimately lead to their downfall? He thought about the cycles of violence that had plagued history, the way each generation seemed doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. The older engineer's reflections were interrupted by the arrival of the younger man. He sat down beside him, his face showing the strain of recent events. "Can't sleep?" the older engineer asked, his voice carrying a note of concern. The younger man shook his head. "No, it's hard to shut off my mind. I keep thinking about what we've done and whether it's worth it. I keep wondering if we're just perpetuating the cycle of violence." The older engineer sighed, his gaze thoughtful. "We're all grappling with the same questions. The challenge is to find a way to navigate this struggle without losing our humanity. We have to be vigilant to ensure that our quest for vengeance doesn't consume us." The younger man nodded, his expression reflecting the weight of the discussion. "It's a heavy burden. I just hope we can find a way to honor our past without letting it define our future." The air inside the human encampment was thick with tension, a quiet stillness settling over the survivors as they mulled over their recent battles. Their collective weariness was palpable, but something new stirred in the distance, an unease that went beyond the consequences of war. The time had come for a decision that would shape not just their future, but the future of everything they had fought for. The Council's tyranny stretched far beyond Earth, and they weren't the only species that had suffered under its cruel dominance. Talk of an alien race, once oppressed by the Council, had reached them through intercepted transmissions. The idea of allying with another species, especially after everything humanity had endured, was met with skepticism. But the reality was unavoidable. They could no longer fight this war alone. Their numbers had been diminished, their resources stretched thin. For the first time since the fall of Earth, they were forced to confront a bitter truth. Victory would require compromise, and that compromise might come in the form of an alliance with beings who, not so long ago, would have been seen as enemies. The warrior scientist sat with the others, his eyes scanning the data streaming in from their communication network. The intercepted signal came from a planet known as Earthall, home to a race called the Threscians. This race, much like humanity, had suffered under the Council's rule. Their cities had been torn apart, their people enslaved, and their culture eroded by centuries of oppression. Yet, unlike humanity, they had survived in the shadows, playing a careful game of submission and resistance. "We have no other option," the woman said, her voice cutting through the silence. "We're running out of time, and if we're going to stand any chance against the Council, we need allies." The younger man, sitting near the back of the room, shifted uncomfortably. "Allies? You're suggesting we trust aliens? After everything we've been through, after everything we've seen?" The woman met his gaze, unflinching. "They've suffered just as we have. Maybe even more. The Council didn't just destroy their planet, they tried to erase their entire way of life. If anyone understands what we're fighting for, it's them." The older engineer, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "The question isn't whether we can trust them. The question is whether we can afford not to." The warrior scientist, still poring over the data, finally spoke. "There's more at stake here than just trust. We're talking about a species we know very little about. If we ally with them, we're opening ourselves up to vulnerabilities. This isn't just a tactical decision, it's a moral one." The journey to Earthall was long, and the tension within the crew simmered beneath the surface. Each of them carried the weight of the past battles, and now they faced the uncertainty of this new alliance. The warrior scientist couldn't help but reflect on the significance of this moment. They had spent so much time fighting to preserve what remained of their humanity, and now they were about to stand side by side with beings who might not even share the same values or understanding of life. When they finally arrived, the sight of Earthall was unlike anything they had anticipated. The planet was a mixture of desolation and beauty, its cities seemingly abandoned, yet there was a sense of resilience in the air. The architecture was alien, both in form and function, with towering structures that spiraled into the sky, covered in intricate patterns that told stories of a culture long suppressed, but still clinging to life. A delegation awaited them on the landing pad, several Threscians, tall and slender, their features a blend of sharp angles and soft curves. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their eyes wide, reflective, seemed to take in everything with an unsettling calm. The woman took the lead, her posture tense but composed as she approached the Threscian delegation. The warrior scientist followed closely behind, flanked by the younger man and the older engineer. One of the Threscians, a leader by the looks of him, stepped forward. His voice was low, resonant, and carried an air of solemnity. "We've been waiting for you. The Council's reach extends far, and we've long sought allies to join us in resisting their tyranny." The woman nodded. "We've heard of your struggles. We're here to discuss an alliance, but understand, trust will take time." The Threscian leader tilted his head slightly, as if measuring her words. "Trust is a fragile thing, but we both know that survival demands cooperation, even when trust is uncertain." As the negotiations began, the differences between the two species quickly became apparent. The Threscians, though peaceful in demeanor, were deeply pragmatic. Their survival had depended on subterfuge and patience, whereas humanity had been forced into a corner, driven by rage and a thirst for vengeance. The warrior scientist found himself at odds with the Threscian leadership. Their cold, calculating approach to resistance contrasted sharply with humanity's emotional investment in the fight. He could feel the tension rising within him as the discussions progressed. "We need to strike now," he said during one of the meetings, his frustration evident. "The longer we wait, the more time the Council has to strengthen their defenses." The Threscian leader regarded him with an unreadable expression. "Patience has been our greatest weapon. The Council expects resistance. What they don't expect is for us to bide our time, to strike when they are least prepared." The woman, sensing the growing divide, intervened. "We both want the same thing, the fall of the Council. But we have to find a way to balance our approaches. We can't afford to act rashly, but we also can't wait forever." The tension between the two groups was palpable. Each side carried the weight of their history, their losses, their desire for revenge. Yet it was becoming clear that this alliance would only work if they could find common ground, if they could learn to trust one another despite their differences. As the days passed, the humans and Threscians began to interact on a more personal level. The younger man, despite his initial reluctance, found himself in conversation with one of the Threscian soldiers, a quiet, observant being named Zarek. The two of them sat by a small fire one evening, the orange glow casting long shadows across their faces. "You seem uncomfortable here," Zarek observed, his voice soft but direct. The younger man hesitated before responding. "It's hard to trust anyone who isn't human after everything we've been through." Zarek nodded, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "I understand. We Threscians have lived with that same distrust for centuries. The Council turned us against each other, made us believe we were alone in our suffering. But now, perhaps, we can find strength in unity." The younger man looked at him, his expression conflicted. "It's not just about trust, it's about survival. We've lost so much: our planet, our people, and now we're being asked to rely on beings we don't even know." Zarek's gaze softened. "We've lost much as well. The Council took everything from us: our homes, our freedom, our culture. But if we let that loss define us, if we let it control us, then we've already lost. The only way to win is to find something worth fighting for, something beyond vengeance." Meanwhile, the older engineer had struck up a conversation with one of the Threshan scientists, a meticulous and analytical individual named Kurth. Their discussions ranged from technology to philosophy, as they sought to understand each other's perspectives. "Your species has developed remarkable technology," Kurth remarked during one of their conversations. "But it seems driven by a singular purpose: war." The older engineer nodded, his expression somber. "We didn't have much of a choice. War became a necessity for survival. But now, I wonder if it's all we've become." Kurth studied him for a moment before responding. "War may have shaped you, but it doesn't have to define you. There's more to life than conflict. Perhaps this alliance can show us all a different way forward." Despite the growing connections between individuals, the alliance remained fragile. Suspicion lingered on both sides, and the question of betrayal loomed large. The Threshans were cautious, always calculating, always watching. And the humans, driven by their intense need for justice, found it difficult to fully trust these new allies. The warrior scientist, in particular, struggled with the moral implications of their alliance. He knew they needed the Threshans, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a fine line between survival and compromise. As he watched the interactions between the two species, he couldn't help but wonder if they were making a mistake. Was this truly the path to victory, or were they simply delaying the inevitable? Darkness permeated everything, a cold, quiet expanse that had swallowed up the stars themselves. No light, no sound, just the deep, empty silence of the universe, as vast and indifferent as ever. For the humans aboard the ship, the stillness was overwhelming. It pressed on their minds, seeping into their thoughts like the chill of an unrelenting winter. The warrior scientist stood alone, staring into the abyss, his reflection barely visible against the darkness outside. His hands rested on the cold railing, his fingers tracing the grooves in the metal absently. The weight of it all, the destruction of Earth, the thousands of years spent in cryosleep, the looming war with the Council, it bore down on him now more than ever. He was a soldier, trained to fight and survive. But here, in this endless night, there were no battles to win, no enemies to outsmart. Only silence, and the questions that haunted him in its wake. Who were they now? What did it all mean? They had been asleep for 3,000 years, their bodies preserved in stasis, while the universe continued to spin on without them. They were no longer the humans they once were, not truly. The world they had fought to protect was gone, its people scattered or dead. The vengeance they sought now seemed distant, almost irrelevant against the backdrop of the infinite. The Council was their enemy, but what did it matter if Earth was no longer there to save? The woman entered quietly, her presence gentle but grounding. She stood beside him, her eyes searching the void. For a while, neither of them spoke. There was no need for words, not yet. They both knew the thoughts that swirled in each other's minds. Finally, she broke the silence. "It feels different now, doesn't it?" He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the darkness. "Everything feels different. We're not who we were." Her voice was soft, but there was a weight to it. "Do you ever wonder what the point is? Now that Earth is gone, now that we've seen how vast the universe truly is, do you wonder if any of it matters?" He turned to look at her, searching her face for the answer to a question he wasn't sure how to ask. "I think about it all the time," he admitted. "I wonder if vengeance is enough, if it's even worth it." The woman's eyes remained fixed on the distant stars. "I think about it too," she said. "But it's not just about vengeance. It's about us, what we've become." There was a long pause as her words settled between them. He understood what she meant, but the truth of it was difficult to accept. They had awakened with a purpose to avenge their fallen world, but the longer they spent in the cold silence of space, the more that purpose felt hollow. What was left to fight for? What did vengeance mean when there was no one left to remember the wrongs done to them? "I've spent my life fighting for something," the warrior scientist said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now, I don't know what that something is anymore." The woman turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Maybe that's the point," she said. "Maybe we're meant to find a new purpose, one that isn't tied to the past." He didn't respond, He didn't know how to. The idea of letting go of the past, of everything they had lost, felt impossible. Yet, deep down, he knew she was right. They were no longer the people who had once fought to save Earth. That world was gone. All they had now was the present and the future that lay ahead. Elsewhere on the ship, the younger man sat alone in his quarters, staring at a faded photograph of his family. It was one of the few mementos he had from the old world, a reminder of the life he had once known. His parents, his sister, they had all been gone for thousands of years. He didn't even know where their bodies lay, or if they had been reduced to ash along with the rest of the planet. He had never had the chance to say goodbye. The younger man traced his fingers along the edges of the photograph, feeling the weight of it in his hands. What had they fought for, if not for people like his family? But now, with Earth gone, what was left? Who were they avenging? A tear slipped down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. The silence of space seemed to cradle his sorrow, amplifying the emptiness inside him. His anger, his grief it had once driven him, fueled his desire for revenge. But now he felt lost. The universe had moved on, and he didn't know where he fit in anymore. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was the older engineer, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes kind. "I thought you might need some company," the older man said as he stepped inside. He glanced at the photograph in the younger man's hand, but didn't say anything about it. The two of them sat in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken thoughts hanging between them. "It's hard, isn't it?" the older man finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "Waking up to find that everything you knew is gone." The younger man nodded, his grip tightening on the photograph. "I thought I could handle it. I thought the anger would be enough to keep me going. But now, I don't know." The older man placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. None of us do. We've been through something unimaginable. It's going to take time to figure out who we are now." The younger man swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "I just don't know if I can keep fighting for something that doesn't exist anymore." The older man sighed. "I don't think any of us are fighting for Earth anymore. We're fighting for each other, for the ones who are still here, and maybe that's enough." Back in the observation deck, the woman continued to stare into the void, her mind racing with thoughts of the past and the future. She had been a leader in the resistance, a symbol of hope and strength for those who had followed her into battle. But now, she wasn't sure what role she was meant to play. The weight of command had always been heavy, but now it felt suffocating. She thought of the Threscians, of the fragile alliance they had forged. Trust was hard to come by, and she knew that betrayal could come at any moment. Yet, there was something about the Threscians that intrigued her. Their resilience, their quiet strength, it reminded her of humanity in some ways. Maybe there was hope for them after all. But the question still lingered. Who were they now? What was their place in this vast, indifferent universe? The woman closed her eyes, letting the silence of space envelop her. She knew that they couldn't turn back now. They had already come too far. The cold emptiness of space hummed around the human fleet, a vast silence pierced only by the occasional distant signal or the low thrum of the ship's engines. Yet aboard the lead vessel, there was no silence in the hearts of those aboard. The crew was alive with the knowledge that soon they would strike a decisive blow. Their target, Varric, a small outpost on the edge of the Galactic Council's territory. This was not just any outpost. It was a symbol, a sign to the galaxy that the humans, long thought extinct, were very much alive and ready to bring war to those responsible for Earth's destruction. Inside the command room, the atmosphere was tense. Strategic plans glowed on the holo display, maps of Varric's defenses, the Council's patrol routes, and the likely response times of nearby fleets. The survivors stood around it, their eyes not on the glowing projections, but on each other, understanding the gravity of the decision before them. This wasn't just a battle. It was their first step towards retribution. "We move at dawn," Mara stated, her voice calm, but carrying a weight that wasn't easily hidden. "At dawn?" the commander echoed, his eyes flickering to each of the crew members gathered around the table. No hesitation. We go in hard, and we leave no trace of the council behind. It was a cold strategy, one that didn't sit well with everyone in the room. Eric, standing off to the side, his arms crossed, clenched his jaw. He'd fought hard alongside the others, but every step forward seemed to deepen the conflict within him. What were they fighting for? Was it simply vengeance for Earth, or something more, something darker? A silence settled over them once more, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that gave peace. It was suffocating. Mara's gaze turned towards him, sensing his hesitation. "You have something to say, Eric." He uncrossed his arms, pushing off from the wall. "We're walking into this with our eyes set on destruction. I understand that. But we need to be sure that we're not becoming the very thing we hate. If we wipe out Verk, we need to know why. Just killing isn't enough." Lena, one of the newer members of the crew, chimed in. "It's not just about killing, Eric. It's about sending a message. If we don't make our presence felt, the council will continue to brush us aside. We need them to fear us." Eric shook his head. "Fear us? Is that really what we've come to? Do we want to inspire the same terror that the council instilled in us?" Mara stepped forward, her voice measured but firm. "We didn't choose this path. The council did when they annihilated our home, our people. We were forced to wake up to a galaxy that moved on without us, one that barely remembers humanity. Now we remind them." "At what cost?" Eric pressed, his voice rising slightly. "If we lose ourselves in this, then what's left of humanity?" There was a pause, a deep quiet, as the weight of his words hung over the room. These weren't just tactical decisions. They were moral choices, and each step towards revenge carried with it the risk of losing the very thing they were fighting for, what it meant to be human. Before anyone could respond, a sharp beeping cut through the air. The command table flickered, new data flooding the screen. The Council's patrol fleet was shifting. Verk's defenses were being reinforced. They had to act now. Mara looked to Eric one last time, her eyes softening for just a moment. "We don't have time to debate this. You know that." And with that, the decision was made. The descent onto Verk was swift and silent. The small outpost, nestled in the shadow of a large moon, seemed almost peaceful from above. But below that serenity, they knew it was anything but. The crew moved in unison, the training that had been drilled into them taking over. In moments like these, there was no room for hesitation. They breached the atmosphere, and within minutes, their landing pods crashed into the outskirts of the base. The attack was fast and brutal. Plasma blasts lit up the night sky, and the alien soldiers stationed at Verk barely had time to react. Eric moved through the chaos, his heart pounding not just from the exertion, but from the conflict raging inside him. He saw the fear in the eyes of the alien soldiers as they fell, the same fear that he had felt so many times before. But there was no time to dwell on it. The mission was clear. Destroy the outpost. Leave nothing behind. Lena covered his flank, her movements sharp and efficient. "We need to hit the command center," she shouted over the commotion. He nodded, and the two of them pressed forward, cutting through the remaining defenses. The closer they got to the center of the outpost, the heavier the resistance. But it was no match for the humans' warriors who had been forged in the fires of loss and vengeance. As they breached the final door, the command center lay before them. Alien officers scrambled, trying to mount some kind of defense, but it was too late. The humans had come to deliver their message. But as Eric raised his weapon, something stopped him. His finger hovered over the trigger. In the dim light of the command room, he saw not just enemies, but beings fighting for their own survival. Were they really so different from him? Time seemed to slow. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the weight of choices that could not be undone. Mara's voice crackled in his ear. "Finish it, Eric." But he hesitated. In that moment, as he stood there, weapon in hand, the reality of their situation hit him like a wave. They had become what they had sworn to destroy. Warriors without compassion, driven only by vengeance. Was this really the path they were meant to walk? He looked at the faces of the alien officers, terrified and desperate, and saw his own reflection in them. It was then he realized that vengeance alone was not enough. It could never fill the void left by Earth's destruction. It could never bring peace. Slowly, he lowered his weapon. "We're done here," he said into the calm. "Let's go." The aftermath of the battle left a heavy silence in its wake. The crew gathered back aboard the ship, weary from the fight, but none more so than Eric. The others didn't question his decision, though the tension in the air was palpable. They had won, but at what cost? Mara approached him, her expression unreadable. "You had the chance to end it." "I know," he replied quietly, his gaze distant. "You let them live." "They're not our enemies," Eric said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet conviction. "Not really. They're just like us trying to survive." Mara frowned. "They work for the Council. They're part of the system that destroyed us." "Maybe," he admitted, "but killing them won't bring Earth back." There was a long pause as Mara studied him, her eyes searching for something. "So what now?" Eric looked out the viewport, the stars stretching endlessly before them. "We keep fighting," he said, "but we need to remember what we're fighting for." He turned to face her, his expression resolute. "We're not here to become monsters. We're here to make sure the galaxy never forgets what it did to us." The night stretched on, the stars silent witnesses to the weight of their choices. As the crew drifted into a restless sleep, Eric remained awake, his mind racing with thoughts of the battle, the lives he had spared, and the path that lay ahead. He knew the war was far from over, but for the first time, he questioned what kind of victory they were truly seeking. In the quiet of the ship, he closed his eyes, a single thought echoing in his mind. What does it mean to win if you lose your soul in the process? The ship, the Erebus, hummed as it cut through the vast expanse of space. Inside, the silence that had followed the battle weighed heavier than ever before. Eric sat alone in the observation chamber, the cold glow of distant stars reflecting off the glass in front of him. His eyes were distant, lost somewhere between the memory of Verk and the cold reality of what they'd just done. He had been in battles before, had taken lives. Yet something about this one felt different, wrong even. For the first time, he wondered if they were truly justified in their actions. The question gnawed at him, an uncomfortable presence that wouldn't go away, no matter how much he tried to bury it beneath the mission. The door slid open, and Lena stepped inside. Her boots made soft thuds against the metal floor, but she didn't speak at first. She stood a few paces behind Eric, watching the stars as well. "You're thinking about them," she finally said, her voice a quiet ripple in the stillness. Eric didn't turn around. He continued staring out into the infinite black, his thoughts still tangled. "Yeah, I am." "You think we made a mistake," Lena said, more as a statement than a question. She moved closer, leaning against the bulkhead beside him. Eric exhaled slowly. "I don't know if it was a mistake. I wonder if this is the right way. What we did back there, those soldiers, the people in that outpost, they weren't the ones who destroyed Earth. They were just following orders, like we used to." Lena folded her arms, her brow furrowing slightly. "They would have killed us without a second thought." "Maybe," Eric agreed, his voice quiet. "But that doesn't make it right." She sighed and leaned her head back against the wall. "This war isn't going to be clean, Eric. We knew that when we woke up. We're fighting for survival. Sometimes it means doing things we're not proud of." Eric finally looked at her, his face etched with conflict. "Are we fighting for survival, or are we just fighting for revenge?" Lena's expression softened. She understood the question, the weight of it. "Both," she said after a long pause. "We're fighting to make sure no one else suffers the way we did. And yeah, maybe part of it is revenge. But if that's what it takes to get justice, then so be it." Eric nodded slowly, though his mind wasn't entirely at ease. Justice, revenge. The two concepts seemed to blur the longer they stayed on this path. But he couldn't argue with her. Not after everything they'd lost. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was the only way. Still, something deep inside him resisted. The crew gathered in the common room the following morning. Tensions were high, though no one spoke of it directly. They all felt the weight of what had happened at Verk, even if they didn't say it aloud. Mara stood at the front, a data pad in her hand, her expression unreadable. "We've received intel from one of our sources within the Council's network," she began, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of tension. "The attack on Verk hasn't gone unnoticed. The Council is mobilizing a response fleet." A murmur went through the room. They had expected retaliation, but not so soon. Mara continued, her eyes scanning the room. "They're consolidating their forces around a key stronghold and industrial hub that supplies much of the Council's war machine. If we can take it out, we'll cripple their ability to reinforce their fleets for months, maybe longer." Eric's stomach twisted at the thought of another battle. The memory of Verk was still too fresh, the lives they had taken too close to forget. But Mara's voice was cold and focused, her gaze locked on the future. "This is our next move," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We strike hard, and we strike fast." No one objected, though Eric could feel the unease radiating through the room. They were soldiers, yes, but they were also human. The line between justice and revenge was becoming harder to distinguish with each passing day. Lena caught his eye from across the room, her expression one of quiet understanding. She felt it too, the weight of their choices, the cost of their actions. But there was no turning back now. The road ahead was set. Hours later, Eric found himself in the ship's gym, working through a series of drills. The repetitive movements helped him focus, gave him something else to think about besides the creeping doubt gnawing at the edges of his mind. But no matter how many times he threw a punch or executed a maneuver, the questions lingered. Why were they really fighting? What was the end goal? Was it truly justice, or had they allowed their anger, their grief, to consume them? The door to the gym slid open, and Mara stepped inside, her eyes immediately locking onto him. Eric straightened, wiping the sweat from his brow as she approached. "You're pushing yourself hard," she said, her tone neutral but with an edge of concern. "Trying to stay sharp," Eric replied, though he knew she could see through the excuse. Mara stopped a few feet away, her expression inscrutable. "I can tell something's been bothering you since Verk." Eric didn't respond at first, unsure of how to articulate the conflict swirling inside him. He had always trusted Mara. She had been their leader, their guide since they'd woken from their long sleep. But now, for the first time, he wasn't sure if they were on the same page. "Vark didn't sit right with me," he finally admitted, his voice low. "I know we needed to send a message, but, I don't know, it just felt wrong." Mara's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't speak right away. Instead, she crossed her arms, as if weighing his words. "It wasn't easy for any of us," she said after a moment. "But we don't have the luxury of second-guessing ourselves. Not now. The Council is a threat, Eric, and if we don't stop them, they'll do to others what they did to Earth." "I get that," Eric said, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "But if we lose ourselves in the process, then what's the point? If we become like them, are we any better?" Mara's gaze hardened, and for a moment, Eric thought she might dismiss his concerns outright. But instead, she took a step closer, her voice lowering to something more personal. "You think I don't feel the same way?" she asked, her tone laced with an unexpected vulnerability. "You think I don't lie awake at night, questioning every decision I've made since we woke up? But we don't have the luxury of doubt, Eric. Not anymore. If we hesitate, if we question ourselves now, we lose everything." Eric looked at her, surprised by the emotion in her voice. Mara had always been the strong one, the unshakable leader who never let her guard down. To see this side of her, a side that wasn't entirely sure of their path, was jarring. But it also made him realize something. They were all struggling. They were all carrying the weight of their choices. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't about having all the answers. Maybe it was about carrying that weight together, even when the road ahead was unclear. "I'm not saying we stop fighting," Eric said quietly. "I'm just saying we need to remember what we're fighting for." Mara held his gaze for a long moment, then finally nodded, though her expression remained serious. I hear you. But we have to keep moving forward. The Council isn't going to wait for us to figure things out. I know, Eric replied. But we can't let them dictate who we become either. Mara didn't respond to that, but Eric could see the conflict in her eyes. She understood, even if she couldn't admit it outright. The silence between them stretched on for a few more moments before Mara finally turned to leave. Get some rest, she said over her shoulder. We'll need you at your best for the next mission. Eric watched her go, the weight of their conversation settling over him. He wasn't sure if he had made a difference, but at least the seeds of doubt had been planted. The silence after the battle was suffocating. Inside the Erebus, the crew moved like phantoms, weighed down by something deeper than exhaustion. The aftermath of the siege had left them not only physically drained, but emotionally fractured, each member caught in the quiet torment of their own thoughts. Eric sat in his quarters, the dim light from the console casting long shadows on the walls. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together. The weight of everything they had done pressed down on him, tightening like a vice. The memory of Verk burned inside him, a fire that refused to go out. Not just the battle, but the faces, alien and human alike, that had stared back at him as the final blow was struck. In those last moments, it wasn't just victory or revenge he saw. It was loss. It was guilt. It was the heavy realization that the path they were on could consume them if they weren't careful. Eric's door chimed. He didn't answer right away, his thoughts still tangled in the recent chaos. But when the chime rang again, more insistent this time, he finally stood, crossing the small space to let whoever it was inside. Lena stepped through the doorway. Her expression was hard to read, but there was a weariness in her eyes, the same weariness Eric saw in himself when he caught his reflection in the glass. She didn't say anything right away, just hovered near the threshold, her gaze scanning the room as if searching for something that would help her make sense of what had happened. We need to talk, she said finally, her voice soft but carrying an edge of urgency. Eric motioned for her to sit, but Lena remained standing, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She stared at the floor for a long moment, as if organizing her thoughts before she spoke again. I've been thinking about what you said before the siege, she began, her voice low, almost hesitant. About whether we're fighting for survival or just revenge. Eric felt a knot form in his chest. He'd been wrestling with that very question ever since the battle at Verki, and every time he thought he had an answer, something would unravel it again. Lena looked up, meeting his gaze. I didn't want to listen at the time, she admitted, but now I can't stop thinking about it. What are we doing, Eric? Are we still fighting for Earth? Or have we become something else entirely? He stared at her, unsure of what to say. The question was one he couldn't answer for himself, let alone for her. The mission, the vengeance, the overwhelming need to strike back at the Council, it had all seemed so clear in the beginning. But with each battle, each death, that clarity had begun to fade. Lena sat down, resting her head in her hands. I thought killing them would make me feel something, she whispered, her voice cracking. That it would give me closure or make the pain go away. But it didn't. All I feel is emptiness. Eric sat down across from her, unsure of what to say. He could feel her pain, but it mirrored his own too closely for him to offer any real comfort. The vengeance doesn't fill the hole, he said quietly. It never could. Lena looked up at him, her eyes red with suppressed tears. Then why are we still doing this? It was a question Eric had been avoiding for weeks now. There had always been an assumption that their mission was righteous, that it was about justice for Earth. But the deeper they went, the more he began to wonder if that was just a convenient lie they told themselves. We're doing it because we don't know how to stop, Eric said, his voice heavy. Because if we stop, if we admit that revenge isn't enough, then we have to face everything we've lost. And I don't know if any of us are ready to do that. Lena's expression softened, and for the first time in weeks, Eric felt like they were seeing each other clearly, not as soldiers or comrades, but as two broken people trying to navigate the wreckage of their lives. "What happens when the war is over?" she asked. "When there's no one left to fight?" Eric looked away, unable to meet her gaze. He had no answer. He didn't know what came after. He wasn't sure there even would be an after. Mara stood in the command center, staring at the tactical display as the aftermath of the siege scrolled across the screen. Casualty reports, resource counts, tactical analyses, it all blended together. A sea of data that felt cold and distant compared to the heat of the battle they had just fought. But it was the silence in the room that unnerved her the most. The crew usually talked after missions, shared their thoughts, their fears. But now they were fractured. The weight of their choices had begun to settle over them like a suffocating blanket, and Mara could feel the strain pulling them apart. She pressed a hand to her forehead, massaging the tension that had been building there for days. She had led them through so much already, had guided them through the chaos of their reawakening and the long years of war that followed. But now she wasn't sure if she had the strength to keep them together. Her thoughts drifted to Eric. He had been different since Varric. More distant, more introspective. His quiet doubts had been growing louder, and Mara could feel them seeping into the rest of the crew. She hated to admit it, but part of her feared he was right. That they were losing themselves in the war, that vengeance had become their only purpose. And yet, what else was there? Without the mission, without the fight, what were they? Survivors? Victims? Mara couldn't bear the thought of it. She had spent too long fighting to accept that their struggle might be in vain. The door behind her hissed open, and Mara turned to see Annika step inside. The ship's chief engineer was rarely one for conversation, but there was a look in her eyes that told Mara this wasn't a casual visit. "We need to talk," Annika said bluntly, her voice carrying none of the hesitation that had marked Lena's earlier conversation with Eric. Mara nodded, motioning for her to sit. Annika didn't waste time with pleasantries. "The crew is falling apart," she said. "I don't need to tell you that. You can feel it. We all can." Mara sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I know, but I don't know how to fix it. The mission is all we have left, Annika. If we lose that..." Annika cut her off. "The mission is what's tearing us apart, Mara. People aren't built to carry this kind of hatred, this kind of pain, for so long. We're going to break if we keep going like this." Mara didn't respond right away. She stared at the tactical display, her mind racing. She wanted to argue, to say that the mission was all that mattered, that they had to keep fighting no matter the cost. But the words felt hollow, even to her. "We've come too far to stop now," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Annika shook her head. "Maybe. Or maybe it's time we start asking what comes after the mission. What happens when we win? Or worse, what happens if we don't?" Mara clenched her fists, her knuckles turning white. "We can't afford to think like that, Annika. If we start doubting ourselves now, we lose everything. And if we keep going like this, we'll lose everything anyway," Annika shot back, her voice rising. "The crew is falling apart, Mara. We're not just fighting the Council anymore. We're fighting ourselves." Mara's chest tightened, a surge of frustration and fear rising inside her. She knew Annika was right, but she couldn't bring herself to admit it. Not yet. "We're soldiers," Mara said, her voice cold. "We don't get to walk away from this." Annika stood, her eyes hard. "We're more than soldiers, Mara. Or at least we used to be." With that, she turned and left the room, leaving Mara alone with the silence and her own doubts. Eric stood by the observation window again, staring out at the stars. He could hear the echoes of Lena's words, feel the weight of Mara's struggle, and for the first time, he realized how deeply they had all been scarred by their pursuit of vengeance. The fires of memory burned within him, igniting old wounds and bringing to the surface emotions he had tried to bury long ago. As he stood there, he began to wonder if there was any way to truly move forward without being consumed by the past. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop fighting. The air inside the Erebus was thick, almost oppressive. Conversations had grown sparse over the last few days, as if the weight of something unspoken hovered in the space between each crew member. Mara stood on the bridge, her hands clasped behind her back as she stared out into the void. The stars seemed indifferent, cold and distant, as if they held secrets that she could never grasp. But it wasn't the vastness of space that unnerved her now. It was the tension simmering beneath the surface of her crew, the feeling that something was about to shatter. It had started with small things. Missing files, unexplained delays in communication, orders that were somehow lost in translation. At first, they had chalked it up to the chaos of war. The constant pressure, the exhaustion, they were all frayed around the edges, after all. But then came the sabotage. A minor glitch in the ship's navigation systems had sent them off course for nearly 6 hours during the siege. It was enough to make Mara pause, but not enough to draw any conclusions. Not yet. But now, standing here, she could no longer deny what had been gnawing at her. There was a traitor among them. She turned to Eric, who stood beside her, his jaw set in that familiar look of grim determination. He had always been her anchor, steady and unyielding, but even now she could see the doubt flickering in his eyes. It wasn't just the external threat they were up against anymore. It was something far more dangerous, something from within. "They're hiding it well," Eric said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, controlled, but Mara could sense the tension behind it. He was trying to remain calm, trying to stay rational, but she knew him too well. The betrayal had shaken him, just as it had shaken her. Mara nodded, her gaze still fixed on the stars. "Too well. Whoever it is, they know how we operate. They know how to stay one step ahead of us." Eric shifted, crossing his arms over his chest. "We'll find them," he said, though there was no comfort in his words. Mara didn't respond. She wanted to believe him, but the truth was, they were already unraveling. Trust was fragile, and once it was broken, there was no going back. The briefing room felt colder than usual, the sterile white walls amplifying the unease that had settled over the crew. Mara sat at the head of the table, her fingers tapping idly against the surface. Around her, the core members of the crew filed in: Lena, Annika, Eric, and a handful of others. Each of them wore the same strained expression, the same tension in their movements. They all knew something was wrong, but no one wanted to say it aloud. Mara cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "We've had too many incidents lately. Missing report, sabotage. I don't need to tell you what that means." Annika, ever blunt, leaned forward in her chair. "Someone's playing both sides." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. No one moved, no one spoke. Mara scanned their faces, watching for any flicker of guilt or fear. But they were all trained too well. If anyone here was the traitor, they weren't going to slip up that easily. "We're going to find out who it is," Mara continued, her voice firm. "But until we do, no one leaves this ship. No outside communications. No unsupervised access to any systems." Lena shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "You're grounding the entire crew." "I'm grounding the entire crew," Mara confirmed. "Until we know who we can trust. No one is above suspicion." Eric glanced at her, his brow furrowed in concern. She could tell he didn't like this. He was the kind of man who believed in loyalty, who trusted in the strength of their bond as a team. But even he couldn't deny that something was deeply wrong. Annika, on the other hand, didn't seem fazed. She had always been pragmatic, unflinchingly so. "I'll run a full diagnostic on the ship's systems," she said, her voice crisp and efficient. "If there's been any unauthorized access, I'll find it." Mara nodded, grateful for Annika's calm, logical approach. But even as she gave the order, a part of her felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. This wasn't just about finding the traitor anymore. It was about survival, about holding this crew together before the fracture became irreparable. Later, in the quiet of his quarters, Eric sat at his desk, staring at the comm pad in front of him. His mind was racing, replaying every conversation, every interaction from the past few weeks. The clues were there, somewhere. He just needed to connect the dots. But the more he thought about it, the more elusive the truth became. His thoughts drifted to Mara. She had always been strong, a pillar of resolve amidst the chaos. But he could see the cracks now. The siege had taken its toll, and this betrayal, it had cut deeper than either of them were willing to admit. He rubbed his temples, trying to fend off the growing headache. Trust was the foundation of everything they had built. Without it, they were lost. Just then, the door slid open, and Lena stepped inside. She hesitated for a moment before walking over to him, her movements cautious, as if she were stepping into dangerous territory. "Eric," she began, her voice softer than usual, "I've been thinking." He didn't look up, didn't respond right away. He could hear the conflict in her tone, the hesitation. It mirrored his own internal struggle. "I don't know who to trust anymore," she admitted, finally taking a seat across from him. "But I know we need to talk about what happens next." Eric glanced up, his eyes locking onto hers. He could see the weariness in her expression, the uncertainty. But there was something else too, something deeper. An urgency that told him this wasn't just about the traitor anymore. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice low. Lena took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. "I'm saying we need to be careful. We can't just focus on finding the traitor. We have to ask ourselves why this is happening. What's driving someone to turn against us?" Eric frowned, not fully understanding. "You think it's not just about the war?" Lena shook her head. "It's never just about the war. It's about survival. It's about the choices we've made, the people we've become. If someone betrayed us, it's because they believe in something different. Maybe they don't see us as the good guys anymore." The words hit Eric like a punch to the gut. He had always seen their mission as just, as righteous, but Lena's words forced him to confront a darker possibility that perhaps the line between right and wrong had blurred long ago. Mara paced the length of her quarters, unable to shake the growing sense of unease. The briefing had done little to quell her fears. In fact, it had only deepened them. She had always believed in her crew, believed that they were united in their cause. But now, doubt gnawed at her like a relentless parasite. She paused in front of the window, staring out at the stars once again. The vastness of space had always calmed her before, reminded her of the greater purpose they served. But tonight, the stars offered no comfort. Instead, they seemed distant, unreachable. Her thoughts turned to the traitor, to the betrayal that had shattered the fragile trust among her crew. Whoever it was, they had been with them for years, fighting alongside them, sharing their victories and losses. How could someone who had been through so much with them turn against everything they had built? The question gnawed at her, keeping her awake night after night. A soft chime interrupted her thoughts, and the door to her quarters slid open. Annika stepped inside, her face grim. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. Mara turned to face her, bracing herself for the worst. "What is it?" Annika handed her a datapad. "I ran the diagnostics like you asked. There's been unauthorized access to our comm systems. Someone's been sending out encrypted messages back to the Council." Mara's heart sank. "Do you know who it is?" Annika hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I traced the signal back to its source. It's Lena." The revelation hit Mara like a physical blow. Lena? Of all people, she would never have suspected her. Lena had been one of the most loyal members of the crew, always fierce in her dedication to the cause. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. Mara's mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Had Lena been a spy all along? Or had something changed, something that had driven her to betray them? But there was no time for hesitation. If Lena was working with the Council, she had to be stopped before she could do any more damage. Mara turned to Annika, her voice cold and resolute. "Lock down all access to the comm systems. No one leaves this ship until we've dealt with this." Annika nodded and left the room, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. Mara stood alone in the silence, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on her like a crushing tide. She had thought they were united, thought they were all fighting for the same cause. But now, she wasn't sure of anything anymore. And as the stars continued to shimmer outside the window, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. In the cold, dim light of the command deck, silence gripped the crew. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, pressing into their minds as though the weight of the galaxy itself bore down on their souls. No one could meet each other's gaze, not after what had just happened. The betrayal was raw, fresh, and left an unhealable wound festering among them. Jared stood by the viewport, eyes fixed on the void of space, though he saw none of it. His mind drifted, pulled between memories and the present, grappling with the brutal truth. His closest confidant, someone he would have trusted with his life, had sold them out. It wasn't just the treachery that stung, it was the betrayal of everything they had stood for, everything they believed they were fighting for. The shattering of that belief echoed louder than any battle they had ever fought. Tara, seated nearby, clenched and unclenched her fists, struggling to control her own spiraling thoughts. Her breaths came in short, sharp bursts, as though each one hurt more than the last. She had been the one to uncover the truth, to pull back the veil of deception that had slowly wrapped itself around them, but the revelation had done nothing to ease her anger. If anything, it had intensified the chasm within her. How could someone from their own ranks, someone who had bled and fought beside them, rip apart the very fabric of their fragile unity? How long did they know? Tara's voice broke the silence, cutting through the tension like a knife. She didn't look at Jared, though. She couldn't. Jared's jaw tightened. He didn't have the answer. Or maybe he did, and that was the worst part. Deep down, there had always been signs, cracks in the foundation that he had chosen to ignore. Maybe because he didn't want to face the possibility that the one thing keeping them together, their shared trust, wasn't as unbreakable as he had convinced himself. "We should have seen it coming," Tara continued, her tone bitter and edged with frustration. "It was right in front of us." Jared remained silent, letting her words hang in the air. Tara wasn't wrong, but admitting that now didn't change anything. The damage was done, and they were left picking up the pieces of their shattered trust. Across the room, Alistair sat hunched over, head in his hands. He hadn't spoken since the betrayal was uncovered. He hadn't moved much, either. Of all of them, Alistair had taken it the hardest. He had always believed in the mission fiercely, unquestioningly. It was his faith in the cause, in the unity of their group, that had driven him through the darkest moments. Now that faith was broken, and the weight of it seemed to have hollowed him out. I thought we were better than this." Alistair's voice was barely a whisper, his words tinged with disbelief. His eyes were wide, staring at the floor, as if the answers he sought might somehow reveal themselves in the patterns of the metal beneath his feet. "We were all naive." Tara's voice was colder now, the bitterness in her tone replaced by something harder, more resigned. "We let our guard down because we thought the enemy was out there," she gestured vaguely toward the darkness of space, "when the real threat was right here, among us." Jared finally spoke, his voice rough, as if the words were fighting to remain inside. "We can't let this destroy us." "And what's left to destroy?" Tara snapped, her anger spilling over. "Look around, Jared. We're barely holding it together as it is. This betrayal, it cuts deeper than anything the Council could have thrown at us. We trusted them. They were one of us." Jared turned slowly to face her, his gaze unwavering. "We don't get to fall apart. Not now. Not after everything we've been through." But even as he said the words, they felt hollow, empty. He knew the truth, the gnawing doubt that crept into his heart like a virus. What was left for them to hold on to? The mission? Their so-called justice? Revenge? Jared sighed, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. It wasn't just the betrayal itself, it was what it represented. The crumbling of their purpose. The disintegration of the unity that had kept them alive all this time. And worse, the realization that they weren't immune to the very flaws they despised in their enemies. "How do we come back from this?" Alistair asked, his voice trembling with uncertainty. Tara shook her head, leaning back in her chair, her eyes now distant. "I don't know if we can." For a moment, no one spoke. They had faced death countless times. They had fought battles against impossible odds, witnessed destruction, loss, and unimaginable horrors. But this betrayal, this fracture within their own ranks, it felt different. Like the breaking of something fundamental, something irreplaceable. Finally, Jared spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. "We still have a mission." "The mission?" Tara's voice was softer now, reflective. "What does it even mean anymore, Jared? We started this fight to avenge Earth, to strike back against the Council for what they did. But now?" Jared's gaze dropped to the floor. He didn't have an answer. Not really, because deep down, he knew the truth. The mission had been born out of vengeance, out of an all-consuming need to strike back at the universe that had taken everything from them. But vengeance was a poison, and it was slowly seeping into them, corrupting their purpose, warping their ideals. "I don't know," Jared admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we've lost sight of what we're really fighting for." Tara's eyes flickered with something, maybe recognition, maybe understanding. "And what is that? What are we fighting for now?" Jared's silence was all the answer she needed. For the longest time, the only sound in the room was the soft hum of the ship's systems, a constant reminder of the emptiness surrounding them. The vastness of space felt like an echo of the emptiness inside each of them, a reminder that no matter how far they traveled, no matter how many battles they fought, the void would always be there, waiting. "We can't just give up," Alistair finally said, his voice stronger than before. "We can't let this be the end." Jared nodded, though he still wasn't sure what the path forward looked like. The betrayal had torn them apart, and the mission, their purpose, was hanging by a thread. But Alistair was right. They couldn't give up. Not yet. Not while there was still anything left to fight for. As Jared looked out at the stars, he couldn't help but wonder if they were simply prolonging the inevitable. Could they really rebuild from this? Could they find a way to move forward, to trust again? Or had the betrayal shattered something within them that could never be repaired? He didn't know the answers. But in that moment, as the ship drifted silently through the black void of space, he felt the weight of the universe pressing down on him. And with it, the inescapable truth that their journey, their fight, was far from over. But for now, all they could do was keep moving forward, one step at a time. The universe was vast, cold, and indifferent. And in the end, perhaps that was the only truth that mattered. The space outside was a perfect mirror to the storm brewing inside the ship. It was quiet, too quiet, like the moments after a volcanic eruption when everything is scorched, broken, and still. But just beneath that stillness, something more volatile churned a tension that couldn't be ignored. A silence that wasn't peaceful, but pregnant with unresolved questions. Jared stood at the center of this silence, his back to the crew. He had always been the one to lead, to push forward when others faltered. But right now, even he couldn't find the words to bring them back from the edge they now teetered on. They had been betrayed, not by an enemy, but by one of their own. The thought gnawed at him, refusing to let go. But in this moment, the betrayal wasn't just about a tactical error or an act of deception. It was about the deeper implications. Had their mission ever truly been what they told themselves it was? Or had the seeds of doubt been planted long before this fracture appeared, quietly growing until they bloomed into full-blown distrust? Behind him, the others gathered in small clusters, murmuring softly among themselves. He could feel the weight of their eyes on his back, waiting for him to say something, anything, to bring clarity to the fog of confusion. But what could he say? That it would be all right. That they would recover, rebuild, and find their way again. Jared didn't believe it himself, and he wasn't about to lie. Alistair, now pacing, finally broke the silence again. "We can't just sit here, Jared. We have to do something." Jared turned slowly to face him, taking in the frayed nerves written across Alistair's expression. His friend's eyes were bloodshot, his posture tense, like he was barely holding himself together. "And what would you have us do?" Jared's voice was low, calm, but it carried an undercurrent of exhaustion. "Rush into another battle? Pretend this betrayal didn't just tear us apart? If you've got a plan, I'm listening." Alistair's jaw tightened. "I'm not saying we should jump into the next fight blind, but we can't fall apart either. We've come too far." "Have we?" Tara cut in, her voice sharp. She had been standing against the far wall, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Look at us, Alistair. We're falling apart because maybe, just maybe, we weren't as united as we thought. Maybe this mission was doomed from the start." The words hit like a slap, and Jared watched as Alistair's face fell. He looked like he wanted to argue, to push back against the accusation, but he couldn't. Not after everything that had happened. "You think I don't know that?" Alistair's voice was barely above a whisper now. "You think I don't feel it too?" His gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment he looked utterly defeated. The tension between them hung heavy, like a dense fog that refused to lift. Tara sighed, her anger draining as quickly as it had flared. She ran a hand through her hair, frustration etched into her features. "I'm not trying to tear us down, Alistair. I'm just trying to make sense of all of this." Jared stepped forward, finally breaking his own silence. "We all are. But maybe that's the problem. We're trying to make sense of something that can't be understood. We thought we had a purpose, a mission that would give our lives meaning. But what if that mission was built on a lie?" Tara blinked, surprised by Jared's sudden candor. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe we've been fooling ourselves this whole time. We're out here fighting, bleeding, dying, telling ourselves it's for justice, for vengeance. But what if it's not? What if we're just out here because we don't know what else to do? Because the alternative, going back to whatever life we had before, is too painful to face?" Alistair's brow furrowed as he looked at Jared, clearly unsettled by the direction of the conversation. "You're saying we're out here fighting for nothing?" "No," Jared said, shaking his head slowly. "I'm saying we're fighting because we don't know what else to be. This mission, it's not about saving humanity anymore. It's about us trying to find a way to keep going. To feel like we're still in control of something when everything else in the universe has slipped away." Tara's arms fell to her sides as she absorbed Jared's words. They carried a truth that was hard to deny, even though it wasn't one she was ready to fully accept. "Then what do we do?" Alistair's voice was softer now, almost pleading. "If that's true, if this mission isn't what we thought it was, then what the hell are we still doing out here?" Jared didn't have an answer. None of them did, and that was the most terrifying part of all. As the silence stretched on, something shifted in the air between them. It wasn't a resolution or a plan, it was simply a recognition of the reality they were now facing. The mission, the vengeance, the justice, it had all been a way to fill the void left in their hearts. But the betrayal had exposed that void, and now they were left staring into it, uncertain of what lay on the other side. Alistair's pacing came to a stop, and he stood in front of Jared, his expression weary but determined. "We've lost a lot, Jared, but we haven't lost everything. We still have each other." Jared met his gaze, searching for the strength he knew he needed to find. "And what if that's not enough anymore?" Alistair didn't flinch. "Then we'll find a way to make it enough." It was a simple answer, but in that moment, it was enough to keep them going. Not because it solved the problem, but because it reminded them that they weren't alone in this fight, no matter how broken they felt. Jared turned back toward the viewport, watching as the stars drifted by in the endless expanse of space. He didn't know where they were going from here, but he knew one thing for certain: they couldn't turn back. There was no going back to the lives they had left behind. Not after everything they had seen, everything they had done. And maybe that was okay. Maybe the mission wasn't about justice or vengeance or any of the things they had once believed it to be. Maybe it was simply about survival, about finding a way to keep moving forward, even when the path ahead was shrouded in darkness. As the ship continued its silent journey through the stars, Jared closed his eyes, letting the weight of everything settle into his bones. The betrayal had fractured them, but it hadn't destroyed them. Not yet. They were broken, yes, but they weren't done. Not yet. The ship drifted, a lone speck of human defiance in the infinite void. In the grand scheme of the universe, their struggle might have seemed insignificant, a blip on the radar of cosmic history. But to them, it was everything. It was the only thing that mattered. As Jared stood there, watching the stars, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of connection to the universe. Not in the way he had once believed as a warrior, fighting for a cause greater than himself, but as a human being, small and fragile, yet determined to endure, to continue, even when the odds were stacked against him, even when everything seemed hopeless. Maybe that was the true essence of humanity. Not their strength, not their intelligence, but their ability to keep going, no matter how many times they were knocked down, to keep searching for meaning, even in the face of betrayal and despair. Jared opened his eyes and turned to face his crew, the people who had become his family in this long and brutal journey. They were broken, yes, but they were still standing, and for now, that was enough. "We move forward," Jared said, his voice firm, steady. "We rebuild. We find a new way." Alistair nodded, and Tara, though still hesitant, slowly did the same. It wasn't a grand rallying cry, and it wasn't a solution to all their problems, but it was a step, and sometimes that was all they could ask for. As the ship sailed through the void, Jared allowed himself a small, fleeting sense of hope. Not for the mission, or for vengeance, or for justice, but for the simple act of survival. And in that survival, perhaps, they would find the strength to heal. The deep hum of the ship's engines was the only sound that echoed through the steel corridors, growing louder as they neared their destination. For months, years even, the crew had been preparing for this moment, and yet, standing on the precipice of their final confrontation, none of them felt the closure they had expected. Vengeance had once been a clear path, simple in its promise of retribution. But now, as they drifted toward the Galactic Council's stronghold, the path ahead seemed fractured, uncertain. Jared stood on the bridge, his eyes locked on the massive structure ahead. The Council's stronghold floated in the void, an ominous fortress of steel and shadow, guarded by fleets of ships that hovered like a swarm of insects. This was it, the beating heart of the enemy that had torn their world apart. His knuckles whitened as his grip tightened around the railing. The years of planning, of fighting and bleeding, had all led to this moment. Yet, despite the fire in his heart, a whisper of doubt lingered in his mind. What would be left once they achieved their goal? Would anything change, or would they simply be adding to the endless cycle of destruction? Alistair stood beside him, his face grim but resolute. He had always been the fire to Jared's steady hand, the one who pushed when everyone else faltered. Now, though, even Alistair seemed to feel the weight of what they were about to do. "Are we ready?" Alistair asked quietly, though the question carried more meaning than the simple logistics of their assault. Jared's eyes flickered toward him, reading the unspoken question in his gaze. Ready for what? Ready to die? Ready to kill? Ready to become the monsters they had once sworn to defeat? "We're ready," Jared said, though his voice lacked the conviction he had once felt so strongly. The rest of the crew gathered behind them, their faces a mix of determination and apprehension. Tara, who had been silent for most of the journey, stood with her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the looming fortress ahead. She had always been the cynic, the one who questioned their motives and kept them grounded in reality. Now, though, even she seemed lost in thought, her expression unreadable. "We all know what we have to do," Jared said, his voice firm but quiet. "This is the last push. We take down the Council, and we make them pay for everything they've done." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken doubts. The crew nodded, their resolve clear, but the tension between them was palpable. They had been a team once, bound by a shared sense of purpose. Now, that bond felt fragile, like it might shatter under the weight of what they were about to do. As Jared turned back to the controls, the ship lurched forward, accelerating toward the stronghold. The blackness of space swallowed them, and for a moment, the vastness of the universe seemed to dwarf their tiny vessel. It was a reminder of just how small they were in the grand scheme of things, how insignificant their struggle might seem to the rest of the galaxy. But that didn't matter. It never had. The first wave of enemy ships appeared on the radar, moving swiftly to intercept them. Jared's fingers danced over the controls, issuing commands to the crew. The ship's weapon systems came online with a sharp whir, ready to unleash the full force of their arsenal. A quiet hum of tension filled the air as each crew member prepared for what was to come. "Alistair, take the forward guns," Jared ordered. "Tara, reroute power to the shields." They had been here before. Battle was nothing new to them, but this time the stakes were different. This wasn't about survival. It wasn't about defending their home or their lives. It was about revenge, pure and simple. The thought gnawed at Jared's mind, even as his hands moved with practiced precision over the controls. The first shots were fired. The enemy ships closed in, their sleek forms cutting through the void with terrifying speed. Explosions lit up the darkness like firecrackers, flashes of orange and red against the black canvas of space. Jared could feel the ship shudder with each impact, but they held firm, pushing forward through the storm of enemy fire. Inside the ship, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. The crew moved with the mechanical efficiency of seasoned soldiers, their faces set in grim determination. But as the battle raged on, Jared couldn't help but notice the way their eyes flickered with something more than just resolve. There was fear there, yes, but also a quiet uncertainty and unspoken question that hung in the air between them. What happens when this is over? They had trained for this. They had built themselves up for this final confrontation, each one of them telling themselves that vengeance was the only thing that mattered. But now, in the heat of battle, that certainty seemed to falter. Jared felt it in himself too, a gnawing doubt that had been growing ever since the betrayal within their ranks. Alistair's voice crackled through the comms, pulling Jared from his thoughts. "Shields are holding, but we can't keep this up forever." Jared gritted his teeth, his hands tightening around the controls. "Keep pushing. We're almost there." The ship shuddered violently as another wave of enemy fire slammed into their shields. Jared could feel the strain in the ship's systems, the way the hull creaked under the pressure. But they couldn't stop now. They were too close. Through the viewport, the stronghold loomed larger, its massive structure casting a dark shadow over the battlefield. It was a fortress, impenetrable and unyielding. The heart of the Galactic Council's power, the place where all their decisions had been made, where the orders had been given to destroy Earth. It was the symbol of everything they had fought against. And now they were going to bring it down. As they approached the stronghold, the enemy ships intensified their attack. The air was thick with the sound of explosions, the ship's systems straining under the onslaught. Jared's focus narrowed, his vision tunneling on the target ahead. They had one shot at this. One chance to strike at the heart of their enemy and end this war once and for all. "Prepare the plasma cannons," Jared ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "Target the main reactor. We're going to blow this thing to hell." Tara's fingers flew over the controls, rerouting power to the weapon systems. "Cannons online. Ready to fire on your command." Jared's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. This was it. The moment they had all been waiting for. The culmination of years of planning, fighting, and sacrifice. But even now, as they stood on the edge of victory, Jared couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His hand hovered over the firing controls, his eyes locked on the target. All he had to do was give the order, and the plasma cannons would unleash a torrent of destruction that would bring the entire stronghold crashing down. It would be over. The Galactic Council would be no more. But at what cost? In the silence before the storm, Jared hesitated. His mind flashed back to the faces of those they had lost along the way, the friends, the allies, the innocents who had been caught in the crossfire. He thought of Earth, reduced to a wasteland, its people scattered across the stars. And he thought of the crew standing behind him, waiting for his command. Was this what they had fought for? Was this what they had sacrificed everything for? Alistair's voice broke the silence. "Jared, what are you waiting for? Fire the damn cannons." Jared's hand trembled, his finger hovering over the button that would unleash the final blow. But something inside him stopped him. Something deeper than vengeance, deeper than anger. "What happens after this?" Jared asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alistair frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean? We win. We take them down, and it's over." But Jared shook his head, his gaze distant. And then what? We just walk away. We go back to our lives as if none of this ever happened. Do you really think we can ever go back? The question hung in the air like a heavy weight, pressing down on them all. For the first time, Alistair seemed to falter, his bravado slipping away as he stared at Jared. Tara spoke up, her voice soft but steady. We can't go back, Jared. Not after everything we've done. But maybe we don't need to. Maybe we find a new way forward. Jared's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the chaos of the battle faded into the background. He saw the truth in her words, the quiet understanding that they were no longer the people they had been when this war began. They had been broken, shattered by the violence and the loss. But in that brokenness, they had also found something new, a strength they hadn't known they possessed, a bond that went deeper than vengeance. The plasma cannons hummed with energy, ready to fire at a moment's notice. Jared's hand hovered over the controls, but he didn't press the button. Instead, he took a step back, his decision made. We're not them, Jared said quietly, his voice carrying a quiet conviction. We're not the Council. We don't need to destroy everything in our path to win. Alistair's eyes widened. Jared's mind raced, though outwardly he appeared calm. The weight of his decision settled heavily in his chest as he watched the smoldering ruins of the enemy's stronghold on the ship's viewing screen. It wasn't the sight of destruction that made him uneasy. He had witnessed more than enough in his time. It was the realization that they had chosen a different path when the temptation to destroy had been overwhelming. He turned back to face the crew, each member working tirelessly at their stations. The hum of the ship's systems filled the silence as they began to assess the damage, not only to the ship but to their own morale. Everyone was exhausted. The years of fighting, of planning, of living only for revenge had taken their toll on every soul aboard. Yet, despite the weariness, there was something different now. In the absence of their single-minded pursuit of destruction, something new had begun to take shape: hope. I want a full damage report in 30 minutes, Jared ordered, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but beneath the calm exterior, his thoughts swirled in an endless loop of doubts and questions. Had they truly done the right thing? Would their enemies regroup and retaliate, forcing them into a never-ending cycle of violence? And most pressing of all, what would come next? Now that they had crippled the enemy's stronghold, now that they had refrained from total annihilation, what would become of them? What were they fighting for if not the complete and total destruction of their enemies? He caught the eye of Lieutenant Mira, his second in command, who had stood by his side throughout this brutal campaign. She was one of the few who had always questioned their methods, and now there was something in her eyes, something like understanding, perhaps even approval. She gave a slight nod, her face calm but unreadable. I'll get the team on it, Mira replied, her voice quieter than usual. She lingered for a moment, as if wanting to say more but deciding against it. Jared watched her go, sensing that she too was struggling with the enormity of what they had just done or what they hadn't done. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Kai, one of the younger members of the crew. Despite his youth, Kai had been one of the fiercest fighters, driven by a thirst for vengeance that mirrored Jared's own in the earlier days of their campaign. But now, even Kai looked different. The usual fire in his eyes had dimmed slightly, replaced with something softer, though no less determined. Was it the right call, Captain? Kai asked, his voice hesitant, as if he feared the answer. Jared didn't reply immediately. He took a deep breath, letting the question settle in the space between them. The truth was, he didn't know if it had been the right call. But it was the one he had made, and now they had to live with the consequences, whatever they might be. I think it was, Jared finally said. His voice was firm, though the uncertainty still gnawed at him. We've destroyed enough. If we keep going down that path, what's left at the end? More death? More destruction? At some point, we have to stop. We have to be more than just soldiers. More than just killers. Kai nodded slowly, his face thoughtful. But what if they come back for us? What if this isn't over? They will come back, Jared said, his eyes hardening. That much is certain. But when they do, we'll be ready. and we'll face them on our terms, not theirs. Kai seemed to accept this, though the doubt lingered in his eyes. He gave a respectful nod and turned back to his station, leaving Jared alone with his thoughts once again. He had barely a moment to himself before Mira returned, her tablet in hand. "Damage report," she said, handing the device to Jared. He scanned the report, his brow furrowing. The ship had taken more hits than he realized during the battle. Their shields were at half capacity, and several of their primary systems were operating at minimal efficiency. Repairs would take time they might not have, but they had survived, and that was something. "We've got our work cut out for us," Jared muttered, handing the tablet back to Mira. "Prioritize repairs on the engines and shields. I don't want us caught with our pants down if they come back." "Understood," Mira replied. She hesitated again, glancing around the bridge to ensure no one was within earshot. Then she stepped closer to Jared, her voice low. "I wanted to say, I think you made the right call back there." Jared looked at her, surprised. Mira had never been one to offer unsolicited praise, especially not in the middle of a crisis. Her approval meant more to him than he cared to admit. "Thanks," he said quietly. "I'm serious, Jared," she continued, her eyes locking with his. "We've been through hell these past few years. We've lost so much. But this feels different. For the first time in a long time, it feels like we're fighting for something more than just revenge. It feels like we're fighting for a future." Jared didn't know what to say to that. He had spent so long consumed by hatred, by the need to destroy their enemies, that he had forgotten what it was like to fight for something other than pure survival. But now, as he looked at Mira, he realized she was right. They had a chance, however slim, to build something new, something better. The question was whether they were strong enough to see it through. "I hope you're right," Jared said, his voice soft but sincere. "Because if we're wrong, if this is just another battle in a war that never ends." Mira shook her head. "We'll figure it out, one step at a time." Jared nodded, though the weight of uncertainty still pressed down on him. He watched as Mira returned to her station, leaving him once again alone with his thoughts. The hours passed in a blur of activity. The crew worked tirelessly to repair the ship, their movements mechanical and efficient. But beneath the surface, Jared could sense the shift. The desperation that had once driven them was slowly being replaced by something else, something more complicated. As the ship's systems slowly came back online, Jared retreated to his quarters, needing a moment to himself. He sat at the small desk in the corner, staring out at the stars beyond the window. The galaxy stretched out before him, vast and unknowable, filled with dangers and mysteries he couldn't even begin to comprehend. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to think about the future, not just the next battle or the next mission, but the future beyond the war. What would happen if they survived? If they truly managed to defeat the Galactic Council without destroying everything in their path? What kind of world would they create? The questions weighed heavily on him, but there were no answers, not yet. All he knew was that they had chosen a different path, and now they had to walk it. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. The door slid open, and to his surprise, it was Kai again. The young man looked more nervous than before, shifting from foot to foot as if unsure whether he should be there. "Captain," he began hesitantly, "I just wanted to say, I don't know if I fully understand why you made the choice you did. But I trust you. We all do. And I think we're with you, whatever comes next." Jared felt a warmth spread through him at Kai's words. He hadn't expected this kind of loyalty, not after everything they had been through. But hearing it now, in the quiet of his quarters, it gave him the strength to believe that they could move forward. "Thank you, Kai," Jared said, his voice steady. "I won't let you down." Kai nodded, his expression resolute. "I know." As Kai left, Jared turned back to the stars, his mind clearer than it had been in days. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face it. Together, they would find their way. The remnants of the battlefield lay sprawled across the expanse of the galaxy, a testament to the recent violence. The ships of the Galactic Council had been dismantled, their once formidable structures now floating in the cold void, broken and lifeless. The echoes of combat had long since faded, leaving behind an eerie silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. The human crew, exhausted and disheartened, now stood in the quiet aftermath, trying to grasp the enormity of what they had accomplished. The bridge of their ship had been transformed from a bustling hub of activity into a serene sanctuary. The crew members moved about with a somber air, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and contemplation. The chaos of battle had given way to a profound stillness, and the silence was heavy, almost tangible. Each person carried the weight of their decisions, their losses, and their sacrifices. Jared stood alone at the viewing window, his gaze fixed on the empty expanse of space. The stars that had once seemed so distant now felt indifferent, their light a cold reminder of the universe's vastness and the inconsequential nature of their struggle. The galaxy was as beautiful as ever, yet now it seemed more distant, more unreachable. It was a silent witness to their conflict and a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. He reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The initial quest for vengeance had driven them through countless battles and trials. They had fought not only against their enemies, but against the very darkness within themselves. The brutality of their path had been evident in every fight, every moment of desperation. Yet now, standing amidst the silence, the question remained, what had they truly achieved? The ship's corridors were quiet, save for the soft hum of the engines and the occasional murmur of conversation. The crew had gathered in the common area, their demeanor reflective as they discussed their next steps. The war was over, but the true challenge lay ahead, rebuilding, finding purpose, and coming to terms with the cost of their victory. Mira approached Jared, her face marked by fatigue and introspection. She had been his rock throughout the conflict, and her presence now carried a sense of quiet strength. "Captain," she began softly, "what do we do now?" Jared turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know," he admitted. "For so long, we were consumed by our need for revenge. Now that it's over, we have to find a new purpose. We have to figure out who we are without the war." Mira nodded, her gaze drifting to the window. "It's strange. The silence is almost overwhelming. We fought so hard for this moment, but now that we have it, it feels empty." "It's the silence of reflection," Jared said, his voice carrying a hint of melancholy. "In the chaos, we were driven by our need to fight, to overcome. But now that the fighting is done, we're left with ourselves, and ourselves are not always easy to face." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts and emotions. The crew had endured so much, and the cost of their journey was evident in their weary expressions. They had lost friends, sacrificed their own peace of mind, and faced horrors that had tested their very humanity. As the ship drifted through the void, the crew began to gather in small groups, sharing stories of those they had lost and reflecting on the personal cost of their victory. The bonds that had been forged in the crucible of war were now their source of strength, but they also carried the weight of shared trauma. Jared wandered through the ship, his mind awash with memories of the battles and the people he had fought alongside. He entered the mess hall, where a few crew members were gathered, speaking in hushed tones. Their conversations were tinged with sadness and the lingering echoes of what had transpired. He approached the table where Kai was seated, staring into his drink with a faraway look. Kai had been one of the most passionate fighters, driven by a desire for vengeance that had seemed all-consuming. Now, however, he appeared lost, his youthful zeal replaced by a somber reflection on what had been achieved and what had been lost. "Hey, Kai," Jared said gently, taking a seat across from him. "How are you holding up?" Kai looked up, his eyes tired but filled with a depth of understanding that hadn't been there before. "It's hard, Captain. We've done what we set out to do, but I don't know if it was worth it. I've seen so much, lost so much. And now, with the fighting over, it feels like there's nothing left but the emptiness." Jared nodded, his heart heavy with the same realization. "I know what you mean. We fought for so long, but now that the war is over, We have to face the reality of what we've done. We have to live with the choices we made and the people we lost. Kai took a deep breath, his expression contemplative. I think we have to find a new reason to move forward. We can't let the war define us. We have to build something new, something that gives meaning to all of this. Jared considered Kai's words, feeling a sense of hope amidst the despair. You're right. We have a chance now to make something better. We can't undo the past, but we can shape the future. We owe it to ourselves and to those we lost to try. The crew continued their reflections, each person grappling with their own version of the truth. The silence that had once felt oppressive now began to take on a different quality. It was a silence of potential, of new beginnings. The void of space, once a symbol of their isolation, now seemed to offer endless possibilities. As the ship's systems returned to normal, the crew prepared to leave the remnants of their conflict behind. They would head towards new territories, not as conquerors, but as seekers of a new purpose. The war had changed them, and now they had to find a way to live with those changes. In the end, the silence after the war was not just an absence of noise, but a space for reflection, growth, and the possibility of redemption. It was a reminder that, even in the vast emptiness of space, there was still room for hope, for change, and for the pursuit of a new purpose. The ship continued its journey, carrying its crew into the future with a sense of quiet determination.